Alright then. Hopefully that... Actually, I'm going to turn off that air conditioner before we start. Air conditioner, shush. I said shush. Come on. It'll get there. Probably, maybe, eventually. Anyway. We're going to start off with Monsters of Moyen by Arthur J. Burks. In 1935, the mighty genius of Moyen gripped the Eastern world like a hand of steel. In a matter of months, he had welded the Orient into an unbeatable war machine. He had, through the sheer magnetism of his strange personality, carried the Eastern world with him on his march to conquest of... Dang, this is strangely worded. He had, through the sheer magnetism of his strange personality, carried the Eastern world with him on his march to conquest of the earth, and men followed him with blind faith as men in the past have followed the banners of the thaumaturgists. A strange name, to the sound of which none could assign nationality. Some said his father was a Russian refugee, his mother a Mongol woman. Some said he was the son of a Caucasian woman lost in the Gobi and rescued by a mad lama of Tibet, who became father of Moyen. Some said that his mother was a goddess and his father a fiend out of hell. But this all men knew about him. That he combined within himself the courage of a Hannibal, the military genius of a Napoleon, the ideals of a Sun Yat-sen, and that he'd sworn himself he would never rest until the earth was peopled by a single nation with Moyen himself in the seat of the mighty ruler. Madagascar was the seat of his government, from which he looked across into United Africa, the first to join his confederacy. The Orient was a dependency, even to that forbidden land of the Goloks, where outlanders sometimes went, but once they never returned, and to the wild Goloks he was a god whose will was absolute. To render obedience to whom he was a privilege accorded only to the chosen. The chosen, rather. Yeah. In a short year, his confederacy had brought under his might the millions of Asia, which he had welded into a mighty machine for further conquest. And because the Americas saw the handwriting on the wall, they sent out to see the man Moyen with orders to penetrate his very side. A spy. Their most trusted secret agent, Prester Klieg. Only the ignorant believed that Moyen was mad. The military and diplomatic geniuses of the world recognized his genius and resented it. But Prester Klieg of the Secret Service of Americas, one of the few men whose headquarters were in the secret room in Washington, had reached Moyen, and now he was coming home. He came home to tell his people what Moyen was planning, and to admit that his investigations had been hampered at every turn by the uncanny genius of Moyen. Military plans had been guarded with unbelievable secrecy. War machines he knew to exist, yet had only seen those common to all the armies of the world. And now, 24 hours out of New York City, aboard the SS Stellar, Prester Klieg was literally willing the steamer to greater speed, and in far Madagascar the strange man called Moyen, who'd given the ultimatum. The Western world shall be next. Chapter 1. The Hand of Moyen. "Who's that man?" asked a young lady passenger of the steward, with the imperious inflection which tells of riches able to force obedience from menials who labor for hire. She pointed a bejeweled finger at the slender, soldierly figure which stood in the prow of the liner like a figurehead, peering into the storm under the vessel's forefoot. "That gentleman, milady?" repeated the steward, obsequiously? Beg your pardon, how do I say this? Obsequious. Obsequious, meaning obedient or attentive, so... "That gentleman, milady?" repeated the steward obediently. "That's Prester Klieg, head of the secret agents, master of the secret room, just now returning from Madagascar via Europe, after a visit to the realm of Moyen." A gasp of terror burst from the lips of the woman, and her cheeks blanched. "Moyen! Moyen, the half-god of Asia, whom men call mad?" "No, not mad, milady. Moyen's not mad, save with a lust for power. He's a conqueror of the ages, already ruling more of the earth's population than any man has done before him, even Alexander the Great." But the young lady didn't listen to stewards. Well, the young ladies did not, save when asked questions dealing with personal service to themselves, anyway. Her eyes devoured the slender man who stood in the prow of the Stellar while her lips shaped over and over the dread name which was on the lips of the people of the world. Moyen. Moyen. Up in the prow, if Preister Klieg, who carried a dread secret in his breast, knew the young lady's regard, he gave no sign. There were touches of gray at his temples, though he was still under 40. He'd seen more of life, knew more of its terrors than most men twice his age, because he had lived harshly in service to his country. He was thinking of Moyen, the genius of the misshapen body, the pale eyes which reflected the fires of a satanic soul, set deeply in the midst of the face of an angel, and wondering if he'd be able to arrive in time, sorry that he'd not returned home by airplane. He'd taken the Stellar only because the peacefulness of the ocean liner travel would aid his thoughts, and he required time to marshal it. Liner travel was now a luxury, as all save the immensely wealthy traveled by plane across the oceans. That's actually pretty true here and now. I mean, taking a cruise is a luxury, while a plane is the, way to go. Now Preister Klieg was sorry, for any moment he felt that Moyen might strike. He turned and looked back along the deck of the Stellar. His eyes played over the trimly gowned figure of the woman who questioned the steward, but didn't really see her, and then, good God. The words were like a prayer, and they burst from the lips of Preister Klieg like an explosion. Passengers appeared from the lee of the lifeboats. Officers on the bridge whirled to look at the man who shouted, and seamen paused in their labors to stare. Aloft in the crow's nest, the lookout lowered his eyes from scouting the horizon to stare at Preister Klieg, who was pointing, and all eyes turned in the direction indicated. Climbing into the sky, a mile off the starboard beam, was an airplane with a bulbous body and strangely slanted wings. It had neither wheels nor pontoons, and it traveled with unbelievable speed. It came on, bullet fast, headed directly for the side of the Stellar. "Lower the boats! Lower the boats! For God's sake, lower the boats!" Preister Klieg, in that casual turning, had seen what none aboard the Stellar, even the lookout above, had seen. The aeroplane, which had neither wheels nor pontoons, had risen, as Aphrodite is said to have risen, out of the waves. He'd seen the wings come out of the bulbous body, snap backward into place, and the plane was in full flight the instant it appeared. Preister Klieg had no hope that his warning would be in time, but he'd always feel better for himself for having given it. As the captain debated with himself as to whether this lunatic should be confined as dangerous, the strange airplane nosed over and dived down into the sea. 100 yards from the side of the Stellar. Just before it struck the water, the wings snapped forward and became part of the bulbous body of the thing, the whole of which shot like a bullet into the sea. Preister Klieg stood at the rail, peering out at the spot where the plane had plunged in with scarcely a splash, and his right hand was raised as though he gave a final despairing signal. Of all aboard the Stellar, only he saw the black streak which, 10 feet under water, raced like a bolt of lightning from the nose of the submerged but visible plane, straight as a die for the side of the Stellar. Just a black streak, no bigger than a small man's arm, from the nose of the plane to the side of the Stellar. From the crow's nest came the startled, terrific voice of the lookout, in the beginning of a cry that must remain forever inarticulate. The world in that blinding moment seemed to rock on its foundations, to shatter itself to bits in a chaotic jumble of sound and movement, shot through and through with lurid flames. Klieg felt himself hurled upward and outward, turned over and over endlessly. He felt the storm-tossed waters close over him, and he knew he'd struck. In the moment he knew, oblivion, deep, ebon, and impenetrable, blotted out knowledge. Chapter 2. The Half-Dream. As a roaring, rushing river of chaotic sound first, jumbling sound to which Preister Klieg could give no adequate name. but as he tried to analyze its meanings, he was able to differentiate between sounds and to discover the identity of sound. The river of sound he decided to be the sound of a vibrational explosion of some sort. Vibrational because it had that quivery quality which causes a feeling of uneasiness and fret, that feeling which makes one turn and look around to find the eyes boring into one's back, yet multiplied in its intensity an uncounted number of times. Other sounds which came through the chaotic river of sound were the terrified screaming of the men and women who were doomed. Lifeboats were never lowered for the reason that with the disintegration of the Stellar, everything inanimate aboard her likewise disintegrated, dropping men and women, crew and passengers, into the freezing water of the Atlantic. Prester Klieg dropped with them, only partially unconscious after the first icy plunge. He knew when he floated on the surface, for he felt himself lifted and hurled by the waves. In his half-dream he saw men and women being carried away into wave-shrouded darkness, clawing wildly at nothingness for support, clawing at one another, locking arms, and going down together. The Stellar, in the merest matter of seconds, had become spoil of the sea, and her crew and passengers had vanished forever from the sight of men. Yet Prester Klieg had lived on, knew that he lived on, and there was an element too strong to be disbelieved of reality in his dream. There was a vibratory sense, too, as of the near activity of a noiseless motor. Noiseless motor, where had he last thought of those two words? With what recent catastrophe were they associated? No, he couldn't recall, though he knew he should be able to do so. And then the sense of motion to the front was apparent, an unnumbered sense, rather than concrete feeling. Motion to the front, influenced by the rising and falling motion of mountainous waves. So suddenly as to be a distinct shock, the wave motion ceased, though the forward motion and upward not only continued but increased. That airplane of the bulbous body, the strangely slanted wings. But the glimmering of realization vanished as a sickishly sweet odor assailed his nostrils and sent its swift-moving tentacles upward to wrap themselves soothingly about his brain. But the sense of flight, unbelievably swift, was present and recognizable, though all else eluded him. He had the impression, however, that it was intended that all save the most vagrant, most widely different impressions elude him, that he should acquire only half pictures, which would therefore be all the more terrible in retrospect. Simply must excuse me for long periods of silence. I need to drink some yerba, perhaps yawn. Really, I should sleep instead, but you know me, I tend to put off sleep. The only impressions which were real were those of motion to the front and upward, and the sense of noiseless machinery vibrating the whole nearby. Then a distinct realization of the cessation of the sense of flying, and a return, though in lesser degree, of the rising and falling of waves. This latter sensation became less and less, though the feeling of traveling downward continued. Prester Klieg knew that he was going down into the sea again, down into it deeply, then that odor once more and the elusive memory. Forward motion at last in the depths, swift forward motion, though Prester Klieg could not even guess at the direction. Just swift motion and the mutter of voices, the giving of orders. Klieg regained consciousness fully on the sands of the shore, and he sat up stiffly, staring out to sea. A storm was raging, the sea was an angry waste. No ship showed on the waters, the mad, tumbled sky above it was either empty of planes, or they had climbed to invisibility above the clouds that raced and churned with the storm. Out of the storm, almost at Klieg's feet, dropped a small aeroplane. Through the window a familiar face peered at Klieg. A helmeted, begoggled figure opened the door and stepped out.
Klieg, you gave me the right dope, all right, but I swear there isn't a wireless tower within 100 miles of this place. How'd you manage it?
Kane, you're crazy? I am, or... But Klieg couldn't go on with the thought which had rushed through his brain with the numbing impact of a blow. He grasped the hand of Carlos Kane of the domestic service, and the yellow flimsy cane held out to him. It read simply,
Shipwrecked, am ashore at.
There followed grid coordinate map readings.
Come at once, prepared to fly me to Washington.
It was signed Klieg. Kane, I didn't send this message, said Klieg. What more was there to be said? Horror looked out of the eyes of Prester Klieg, and it was reflected in those of Carlos Kane. Both men turned, peering out across the tumbled welter of waters. Somewhere out there, tight-locked in the gloomy archives of the Atlantic, was the secret of the message which had brought Carlos to Prester, and the agency which had sent it. As Prester Klieg climbed into the enclosed passenger pit of the monoplane, a Mather, his ears seemed to literally be ringing with the drumming, mighty voice of Moyen, but now that voice, instead of merely speaking, rang with sardonic laughter. He'd never heard the laughter of Moyen, but he could guess how it would sound. That airplane of the slanted wings, the bulbous, almost bullet-like fuselage, what of it? It was simple as Klieg looked back to his memoried glimpse of it. The submarine was a metal fish made with human hands. The airplanes aped the birds. The strange ship which had caused the destruction of the Stellar was a combination fish and bird of a sort which merely aped nature a bit further, as anyone who had ever traversed tropical waters would have instantly recognized. But what did it pretend? What ghastly terrors of Moyen roamed the deeps of the Atlantic, of the Pacific, of the oceans of the world? How close were some of these to the United States? The pale eyes of Moyen, he was sure, were already turned toward the west. Klieg sighed as he seated himself beside Carlos Kane. And then Kane pressed one of the myriad of buttons on the dash, and Klieg lifted his eyes to peer through the skylight, where that single press of a button had set in motion the intricate machinery of a helicopter. A four-bladed fan lifted on a slender pedestal sufficiently high above the surface of the wing for the vanes to be free of the central propeller. Then, automatically, the vanes became invisible, and the Mather lifted from the sandy beach as lightly and far more straightly than any bird. As the ship climbed away for the skies, and through the transparent floor of the beach and Atlantic fell away below the ship, a sigh of relief escaped Klieg. They were living. Up here one was free, if only for a moment, and the swift wind of flight brushed all the cobwebs from the tired human brain. He watched the slender needle of the altimeter as it moved around the face of the dial, steadily as the hands of a clock. 30,000, 35, 40. Then Carlos, every moment as effortless as the flight of the silvery winged Mather, thrust forth his hand to the dash again and pressed another button. Instantly the propellers vanished into a blur as the vanes of the helicopter dropped down, the slender staff and the vanes atop themselves fitted snugly into their appointed notches atop the wing. For a second, Carlos Kane glanced at the tiny map to the right of the dash and set down his course. It was a matter of moments only, but while Kane worked, Klieg studied the instruments on the dash, for it had been months since he'd flown, save for his recent dreamlike experience. There was a button which released the mechanism of the deadly guns, fired by compressed air, of course, all operated from noiseless motors. whose muzzles exactly cleared the tips of the Mather's wings, one on the trailing edge, each fitted snugly into the adamant rigging. Four guns which could fire to right or left, twin streams of lead, the number of rounds governed only by the carrying power of the Mather. Klieg knew them all, the guns in the wings, the guns which fired through the three propellers, the guns set 2 and 2 in the fuselage, to the right and left of the pits. Which could be fixed either up or down, all by the mere pressing of buttons. It was marvelous, miraculous, and yet even as Klieg told himself that this was so, he felt, deep in the heart of him, that Moyen knew all about ships like these and regarded them as the toys of children. Kane touched Klieg on the shoulder, signaling, indicating that the atmosphere in the pits had been regulated to their new height and that they could remove their helmets and oxygen tanks without danger. With a sigh, Prester Klieg sat back, and the two friends turned to face each other. "You certainly look done in, Klieg. You must have been through hell and then some. Tell me this about Moyen, that is, if you think you care to talk about him." "Talk about him? Talk about him? It'll be a relief. There's been nothing and nobody on my mind to save Moyen. There's been nobody and nothing on my mind save Moyen for weary months on end. If I don't talk to someone about him, I'll go mad if I'm not mad already. Moyen? A monster with the face of an angel? What else can one say about him? A devil and a saint, a brute whose followers would go with him into hell's fire and sing him hosannas as they were consumed in agony? The greatest mob psychologist the world's ever known. He's a genius, Kane. Unless something is done, the Western world, all the fate of our world, is doomed to sit at the feet and listen to the commands of Moyen. He isn't Oriental, he isn't European, he isn't African or Indian for that matter, but there's something about him that makes one thing of all these singly and collectively. His body's twisted and grotesque, and when one looks at his face, one feels the desire to touch him, to swear eternal fealty to him, until one looks into his eyes almost milky in their paleness, and gets the merest hint of thoughts which could actuate him. If he has a failing, I didn't find it. He doesn't drink, he doesn't gamble. And women? Klieg was madly in love with the sister of Kane, Charmian, and this thing touched him nearest the heart because Charmian was one of her country's most famous beauties, about whom Moyen must have already heard. Women? I scarcely know. He has no love for women, only because he has no capacity for any love save self-love. But when I think of him in this connection, I seem to see Moyen grown to monster proportions, sitting on a mighty throne, with nude women groveling at his feet, bathed in tears, their long hair and mantles of sorrow hiding their shamed faces. It sounds wild, doesn't it? It's the picture I get of Moyen when I will think of Moyen. And of women, for that matter. Many women will love him and have, perhaps, but while he still has taken many, though I am only guessing here, he's given himself none. Another thing, his followers, well, he sets no limits to the lust of men, requiring that only that every soldier be fit for duty, with a body strong for hardship. Good heavens. I'm just real dozy. How long was I out for? What? Who is ringing my phone? I know, someone's streaming D&D. Cool. Anyway, where was I? That sounds wild, doesn't it? But it's the picture I get of Moyen when I think of Moyen and of women. Many women will love him, and have, perhaps, but while he's taken many, though I'm only guessing here, he's given himself to none. Another thing, his followers, well, he sets no limits to the lusts of his men, requiring only that every soldier be fit for duty with a body strong for hardship. You understand? Cain indeed understood, and his face was very pale. Yes, I understand, and as you speak of this man, I seem to see a city in ruins and hordes of men marching, blood-stained men entering houses from which immediately afterward come the screams of terror-stricken women. He shuddered and couldn't go on for the very horror of the vision that had come to him, but Klieg stared at him as though he saw a ghost. Good heavens, Carl. These same identical pictures been in my mind not once but 1,000 times. I wonder who in the world is ringing my phone right now because I'm supposed to be reading a book. Rude. Anyway, he is wondering. He's not wondering why his phone's ringing. That's just me. I wonder. Is it an omen for the future of the West? Deep in his soul, Prester Klieg fancied he could hear the sardonic laughter of Moyen. A tiny bell rang inside the dash, behind the instruments. Cain had set directional finders, had pressed the button which signaled the Washington control station of the national radio, thus automatically indicating the exact spot above land by grid coordinates where the Mather should start down for the landing. An hour later, they landed on the flat roof of the new Capitol building, sinking lightly to a rest as a feather, nursed to a gentle landing by the whirring vanes of the helicopter. Prester Klieg, surrounded by uniformed guards who tried to shield him from the gaze of news gatherers crowded there on the rooftop, hurried into the stairway leading into the executive chambers, and through these to the secret chamber, which only a few men knew, and into which not even Carlos Cain could follow Prester Klieg, at least yet. But one man, a news-gatherer, had caught a glimpse of the face of Klieg, and already he raced for the radio tower of his organization to blazon the Western world the fact that Klieg had come back. Just a moment, we're gonna pause the recording, and no, the air conditioner, no. I paused it to try and stop the air conditioner and try to wake up a little more, but alas, I only did one of those things because the air conditioner refuses to realize that I've turned it off. Rude. Okay. You know, that's just going to be turning off and on during the recording, I guess, which is annoying, but oh well. Anyway, Chapter 4, A Nation Waits in Dread. As Prester Klieg, looking twice as 40 years because of fatigue and almost nameless terrors through which he had passed, went to his rendezvous, the news-gatherer, who shall here remain nameless, raced for the broadcasting tower. Prester Klieg entered the secret room, and at a signal all the many doors shut behind him. Along that interminable stairway were also tightly locked. the newsgatherer, racing for the microphone, and gave the priority signal to the operator. Millions of people would not only hear the words of this newsgatherer, but would see him, note the expressions which chased one another across his face. For television was long since an accomplished, everyday fact. Indeed, that's true.
Prester Klieg of this government's Secret Service has just returned to the United Americas. Your informer has just seen him step from the monoplane of Carlos Kane atop the Capitol building and repair at once to the secret room, closely guarded. But I saw his face, and though he's under 40, he seems twice that. And you know what this country has only guessed at before, that he's seen Moyen the half-man, the enigma of the ages. What does Prester think of this man? He doesn't say, for he dares not speak yet, but your informer saw his face, and it's old and twisted with terror, and...
That ended the discourse of the newsgatherer, and it was many hours before the public really understood. For with the new sentence but half completed, the picture of the newsgatherer faded blankly off the screens in a million homes, and his voice was blotted out by a humming that mounted to a terrific, appalling shriek. Some terrible agency, about which people who knew their radio could only guess, had drowned out the words of the newsgatherer, leaving the public stunned and bewildered, almost groping before a feeling of terror which was all the more unbearable, because none could really give it a name. And the public had heard but a fraction of the truth, merely that Klieg had come back. It had been the intention of the government to deny the public even this knowledge, and it had, but knowledge of the denial itself was public property, which filled the hearts of men and women all throughout the Western Hemisphere with nameless dread. And over all this abode of countless millions hovered the shadow of Moyen. The government tried to correct the impression which the newsgatherer had given out.
Prester Klieg is back,
said the radio. The government speaker tried, for the benefit of those who could see him, to smile reassuringly.
But there's nothing to cause anyone the slightest concern. He's seen Moyen, yes, and he's heard him speak, but there's nothing to distress anyone, and the whole story will be given to you as soon as possible. Klieg has gone into the secret room, yes, but every operative of the government, when discussing business connected with diplomatic relations on foreign powers, is received in the secret room. There is no cause for worry.
It was easy to say that, and the speaker realized it, which was why he could, but with difficulty, make his smile seem reassuring. "Tell us the truth, and tell us quickly," might have been the voiceless cries of those who listened and saw the face and fidgeting form of the speaker. But the words were not spoken, because the people sensed a hovering horror, a dread catastrophe beyond the power of words to express, and so looked at one another in silence, their eyes wide with dread, their hearts throbbing to suffocation with nameless foreboding. So eyes were terror-haunted, and men walked, flew, and rode in fear and trembling, while down in the secret room Prester Klieg and a dozen old men wise in the ways of science and invention, wise in the ways of men and beasts and of nature and of the infinite outside, decided the fate of the nation. That secret room was closed to everyone. Not even the news-gatherers could reach it, not even the all-seeing eye of the telephotograph emblazoned to the world its secrets. But was it secret? Perhaps Moyen, the master mobster, smiled when he heard men say so, men who knew in their hearts that Moyen regarded other earthlings as earthlings regard children and their toys. Did the eyes of Moyen gaze even into the depths of the secret room, hundreds of feet below even the documentary treasure vaults of the Capitol? Sorry about that. No one knew the answer to the question, but the radio, reporting the return of Klieg, had given the public a distorted vision of an embodied fear. And in its heart the public answered yes. And what had drowned out the voice of that radio reporter? No wonder that for many hours a nation waited in fear and trembling, eyes filled with dread that was nameless and absolute, for word from the secret room. Fear mounted and mounted as the hours passed and no word came. In that room, Prester Klieg and the 12 old men, one of whom was the country's president, held council with the man who had come back. But before the spoken council had been held, awesome and awe-inspiring pictures had flashed across the screen, invented by a third of the old men, from which the world held no secrets, even the secrets of Moyen. With this mechanism guarded at the forfeit of the lives of a score of men, the men of the secret room could peer into even the most secret places of the world. The old men had peered and seen things which had blanched their pale cheeks anew. And when they had finished, and the terrible pictures had faded out, a voice had spoken suddenly like an explosion in the secret room.
Well, gentlemen, are you satisfied that resistance is futile?
Just the voice, but to one man in the secret room, and to the others when his numbing lips spoke the name, it was far more than enough. For not even the wisest of the great men could explain how, as they knew, having just seen him there, a man could be in Madagascar, while his voice spoke aloud in the secret room, where even radio was barred. The name on the lips of Prester Klieg.
Moyen.
Moyen. Chapter 5. Monsters of the Deep. Gentlemen, said Klieg as he entered the secret room, where sat the scientists and inventive geniuses of the Americas, we haven't much time, and I shall waste but little of it. Moyen is ready to strike if he hasn't already done so, as I believe. We'll see in a matter of seconds. Professor Manuel, we shall need, first of all, your apparatus for returning the vibratory images of events which have transpired within the last 36 hours. I wish to show you, those of you who failed to see it, the sinking of the Stellar, on which I was a passenger, and I believe the only survivor. Professor Manuel, strangely mouse-like save for the ponderous dome of his forehead, stepped away from the circular table without a word. He had invented the machine in question, and he was inordinately proud of it. Through its use he could pick up the sounds and the pictures of events which had transpired down the past centuries, from the tinkling of the cymbals of the Miriam to all the horror of the conflict the men had called Great War, simply by drawing back from the ether, as the sounds fled outward through space, those sounds and vibrations which he needed. His science was an exact one, more carefully exact than even the measurement of the speed of light, taking into the consideration of dispersion of sound and movement and the element of time itself. The interior of the secret room became dark as Manuel labored with his machinery. Only behind the screen on the wall in the rear of the table was there light. The voice of Manuel began to drone as he thought aloud. There's but a matter of a few minutes difference in time between Washington and the last recorded location of the Stellar. The sinking occurred at 10:30 last evening, you say, Cleve? Ah, yes, I have it. Watch carefully, gentlemen. So silent were the secret agents that one could not have heard the breathing of one of them, for on the screen, misty at first, but becoming moment by moment bolder of outline, was the face of a storm-tossed sea. The liner was slower in forming, and it was slightly out of focus for a second or two. Ah, there it is, said Professor Manuel. Through the sound apparatus came the roaring and moaning of a storm at sea. On the screen, the Stellar rose high on the waves, dropped into the trough, while plumes of black smoke spread rearward on the waters from her spouting funnels. Figures were visible on her decks, figures which seemed carved in bronze. In the prow, every expression on his face plainly visible, stood Klieg himself, and as his picture appeared, he was in the act of turning. Now, look off to the left, gentlemen, a mile from the Stellar, Klieg said it there in the secret room. A rustling sound arose as the scientists shifted in their places. They all saw it, and a gasp burst from their lips as though at a signal. For as the Stellar seemed about to plunge off the shadowed screen into the secret room, a flying thing had risen out of the sea, an airplane with a bulbous body and strangely slanting wings. At the same time, out of the mouth of the pictured figure of Prester Klieg, clear and agonized as the tones of a bell struck in frenzy, were the words, "Lower the boats! Lower the boats! For God's sake, lower the boats!" In the secret room, the real Prester Klieg spoke again. When the black streak leaves the nose of the plane after it's submerged, Professor Manuel, slow your mechanism so that we can see the whole thing in detail. There came a grunted affirmative from Professor Manuel, and the nose of the pictured plane tilted over, diving down for the surface of the sea. Now, don't wait! Instantly, the moving pictures on the screen reduced their speed, and the plane appeared to stop its sudden seaward plunge and to drop down as lightly as a feather. The wings of the thing moved forward slowly, folding into the bottom of the dropping plane. They fold forward so that the speed of the plane and the takeoff will snap them backward in a position for flying. No one spoke because the explanation seemed obvious. Slowly, the airplane went down to the surface of the sea, with scarcely a plume of spindrift leaping back after she'd struck. She dropped to 10 feet below the surface of the water, 100 yards off the starboard beam of the Stellar, her blunt nose pointing squarely at the side of her doomed liner. Now watch closely, for God's sake. The liner rose and fell slowly. Out of the nose of the plane, which had now become a tiny submarine, started a narrow tube of black, oddly like the sepia of a giant squid. Straight toward the side of the liner it went. Above the rail, the secret agents could see the pictured form of Prester Klieg, hand upraised. The black streak touched the side of the Stellar, and as it touched the metal plates, it spread upon impact, growing, enlarging to the right and left, upward and downward, and where it touched the Stellar, the black of it seemed to erase that portion of the ship. In the slow motion, every detail was important and apparent. At a regular speed, the blotting out of the Stellar would have been nearly instantaneous. Klieg saw himself rise slowly from the vanished rail, turning over and over, going down to the sea. He almost closed his eyes, but bit his lips to keep back the cries of terror when he saw the others aboard the liner rise, turn over and over, and fly in all directions like jackstraws in a high wind. The ship was erased from beneath passengers and crew, and said passengers and crew fell into the sea. Out of the depths from all directions came the starving denizens of the sea, starving because liners were now so few. That's enough of that, Professor. Jump ahead approximately 8 hours and see if you can pick up that aero sub after it dropped beyond the Jersey coast. The picture faded out quickly, the screaming of the human beings called back to apparent living by the genius of Manuel died away. And for a space the screen was blank. Then the sea again, storm-tossed as before, shifting there and here, as Manuel sought in the immensity of the sea and sky for the thing he desired. 200 miles south by east of New York City. There it is, gentlemen. They saw it then in full flight, 8,000 feet above the surface of the Atlantic, traveling south by east at a dizzying rate of speed. Note that it keeps safely to the low altitudes in order to escape the notice of regular air traffic. But no one answered. The eyes of the secret agents were on that flashing, bulbous-bodied plane of the strange wings. It appeared to be heading directly for some objective, which must be reached at top speed. For 15 minutes the flight continued. Then the plane tilted over and dived, and at an altitude of still 3,000 feet, the wings slashed forward, clicking in their notches in the sides of the bulbous body, with a sound like the ratchets on a subway turnstile, and holding their breath, the secret agents watched it plummet down to the sea. It was traveling with terrific speed when it struck, and yet it entered the water with scarcely a splash. Then, for the first time, an audible gasp, as that of one person, came from the lips of the agents. For they now could see the objective of the aero sub, a monster shadow in the water at the depth of 500 feet. A shadow which, as Manuel manipulated his instruments, became a floating underwater fortress 10 times the size of any submarine known to the Americas. Sporting like porpoises about in this held in suspension field were myriads of other aerosubs, maneuvering by squadron flight, weaving in and out like schools of fish. The plane which had borne Prester King churned in between two of the formations and vanished into the side of the motionless monster of the deep. And then there was a striking of a deep sea bell, muted by tons and tons of water, which sounded in the secret room. Don't turn it off yet, Manuel. There's more yet. And there was, for the sound of the bell was a signal. The aerosubs darting outward from the sea to the floating fortress, like fish darting to seaweed, plunging up toward the surface of the Atlantic. Breathlessly, the secret agents watched them. They broke water like flying fish, and their necks shot backward from their notches in the myriad bulbous bodies to click in place in a flying position, as the scores of aerosubs took over the air above. The invisible hiding places of the mother submarine. At 8,000 feet, the aerosubs swung in a battle formation, and as though controlled by word of command, they maneuvered there like one vast machine of a central control, beautiful as the flight of swallows, deadly as anything that flew. The secret agents swept the cold sweat from their brows, and signs of terror escaped them all. At that moment came the voice, loud in the secret room, which Klieg at least immediately recognized.
Well, gentlemen, are you satisfied that resistance is futile?
And Klieg whispered the name again, over and over again. Moyen. It was Prester Klieg, master of the secret room, who was the first to regain control after the nerve-numbing question which asked in far Madagascar was heard by the agents in the secret room. No, Moyen in the end will beat you. Only silence answered, but deep in the heart of Prester Klieg sounded a burst of sardonic laughter, the laughter of Moyen. Then the voice again.
The attack is beginning, gentlemen. Within an hour you will have further evidence of the might of Moyen.
Chapter 6. Vanishing Ships. Prester Klieg, ordered to Madagascar from the secret room, had been merely an operative, honored above others in that he had been one of the few at that time ever to visit the secret room. But now, however, because he walked closer to Moyen than anyone else, he assumed leadership almost by natural right, and the men who'd once deferred to him took orders from him. Gentlemen, he snapped, the last words of Moyen still hanging in the air. We must fight Moyen from here. The best brains in the United Americas are gathered here, and if Moyen can be beaten, he will be beaten from the secret room. A sigh came from the lips of Professor Manuel. The President of the United Americas nodded his head as though he too mutely gave authority into the hands of Prester Klieg. The other secret agents shifted slightly, but said nothing. I've been away a year, as you know, and many things have come into regular use since I left. Professor Manuel's machine, for example, he was working on it when I departed under orders. There will be further use for it in our struggle with Moyen. Professor, will you kindly range at the ocean, beginning at once, and see how many of these monsters of Moyen we have to contend with? Monsters of Moyen, there's the title, roll credits. Professor Manuel turned back to his instruments, which he fondled with gentle, loving hands. That's not Manuel, it's Klieg. We have nothing We have nothing with which to combat the attacking forces of Moyen save antiquated airplanes and obsolete warships that are available. Those will be mere fodder. Those will be mere fodder for the guns or rays or whatever it is that Moyen uses in aero subs. Thousands, perhaps millions of human lives will be thousands, perhaps millions of human lives will be lost. But better this than that Moyen rule the West. Better this than that our women be given into the hands of this mob as spoils of war. This is really driving home this women as a spoil of war line. I don't like it. It's gross. But it's from the 1920s. Sometimes you just gotta. That happens, you know. From the secret agents there was a murmur of assent, and then that voice again, startling, clear, with a slight suggestion of some accent in the secret room.
Do not depend too much, gentlemen, upon your antiquated warships. I'm merciful. I won't allow you to send them against me loaded with men to be slaughtered or drowned. Professor Manuel, I'd ask you to turn that plaything of yours and gaze upon the fleet of obsolete ships anchored in Hampton Roads. In passing, Professor, I venture you to guess that the secret of how I'm able to talk with you gentlemen here in your secret room is no secret to you at all. Now look.
The secret agents gasped again in consternation, and from the lips of Manuel came murmured words, even as his hands worked with lightning speed on his machine. His machine is simply a variation of my own, and gentlemen compatriots, with it he could as easily project himself bodily and here into the room with us. Something like a suppressed scream from one of the men. Something like a suppressed scream came from one of the men present. A cold hand of ice about the heart of Prester Klieg, but the words of Manuel were limned on the retina of his brain in letters of fire. Suppose Moyen were to project himself into the secret room, but he wouldn't. He was no fool, and even these secret agents, most of whom were old and no longer strong, would have torn him limb from limb. But these words of Manuel set it whirling once more, and in a new direction, the thoughts of Prester Klieg. Mr. President, gentlemen. Wait, no, that's Manuel, huh? Mr. President, gentlemen. All eyes turned again to the screen upon which the professor worked his miracles, which were today commonplaces, which yesterday had been undreamed of. Every secret agent recognized the outlines of Hampton Road, with Norfolk and its towering buildings in the background, and the obsolete warships riding silently at anchor in the roadstead. For 3 years they'd been there, while a procrastinating cabinet, Congress, and Senate had debated their permanent disposal. They represented millions of dollars in money and were utterly worthless. Prester Klieg, looking at them now, could see them putting out to sea, loaded with brave-visaged men, volunteering to go to sure destruction, to feed the rapacity. To feed the rapacity of Moyden's hordes. Men going out to sea in tubs, singing. But these ships were silent. No plumes of smoke from their funnels, like floating mausoleums filled with dead hopes, shells of past and departed glories. The beating of waves against their sides could plainly be heard. The anchor chains squeaked rustily in their holds. Wind sighed through regal, towering superstructures, and no man walked the decks of any one of them. With bated breath, the secret agents watched. Why had Moyen bidden them to turn their attention to these shells of erstwhile naval grandeur? This time, no gasps broke from the lips of the secret agents. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard, just the sighing of wind through the superstructures of 100 ships, the whispering of waves against rusted bulkheads. Almost imperceptibly at first, the towering dreadnought in the foreground began to move. Slowly, the water swirling about her, she backed away from her anchor and tightened the curve of the anchor chain. Water quivered about the point of the chain's contact with the waves. Quickly, the eyes of the agents swept along the street of ships. The same backward motion of dragging against their anchor chains was visible at the bow of each warship. And with not a soul aboard them, the ships were waking into strange and awesome life, dragging at their anchors like hounds pulling at the leashes to be freed away. How were they doing it? Some electromagnetic force. Professor Blaine, that's your work. Please, notice what is happening and advise us if you see how they're doing it. A grunt of affirmation came from surly obese Professor Blaine. All eyes turned back again to the miracle of the moving ships, and one by one, with crashes which echoed and re-echoed through the secret room, the anchor chains of the dreadnoughts parted. The ends of them swung from the prows of the warships, while the severed portions splashed into the roads, and the waters hid them from view. The great dreadnought in the foreground swung slowly, until her prow was pointed in the direction of the open sea, and though no sea was running, no smoke rose from her funnels, she got slowly ponderously under way, and started out the roads. Behind her in formation, the other ships swung into line, and in a matter of seconds, faster than any of these vessels had ever traveled before, they were racing in a column for the open Atlantic. And from the sound apparatus came wails and shrieks of terror, the lamentations of men and women frightened as they'd never been frightened before. The shores behind the moving column of ships was moment by moment growing darker with people, a sea of people whose faces were as white as chalk with terror. But on out to sea moved the column of the ships. A new note entered the picture, as from all sides airplanes of many makes swooped in and swept back and forth over the moving ships, hooded heads looking out of pits, and the faces of pilots were aghast at what they saw. A ghost column of ships moving out to sea, speed increasing moment by moment unbelievably. Even now, 5 minutes after the first dreadnought had started seaward, the wake of each ship spread away on either hand in the two sides of a watery triangle whose walls were a dozen feet high, racing for the shores with all the sullen majesty of tidal waves. The crowds gave back, and their screams rose into the air in a frightened roar of appalling sound. Even now, so rapidly did the warships travel, many of the planes could throttle down so that they flew directly above the heaving decks of the runway warships. "Get word to them," cried Klieg suddenly. "Get word to them if they follow the ships out to sea, not a pilot will escape alive." One of the agents rose and hurried from the secret room, traveling at top speed for the first of many doors en route to the broadcasting tower from which all the planes could be reached at once. And Prester Klieg turned back to the magic screen of manual. The warships, water thrown aside by the lifting thrust of their forefeet in mountains that raced landward with ever-increasing fury, were clearing the roads and swinging south by east, heading into the wastes of the Atlantic. As they cleared the land, and open water was visible for unnumbered miles. The speed of the mighty ships increased to a point where they rode as high on the water as racing launches, and the creaking and groaning of their bolts and spars were a continual pain of protest, and the sound apparatus accompanying the showing of the miracle on screen. "They're headed straight for that spot where the super submarine lies," said the president, and no one really answered it. Klieg, watching, was racing over in his mind what he could recall of his country's armament. Warships were useless, as was being proved here before his eyes, but there still remained airplanes in countless numbers. They could be diverted from ocean travel and from routine business to battle this menace of Moyen, but he shuddered as he pictured in his mind's eye the meeting of his country's flower-flying manhood with the monsters of Moyen. His eyes, as he thought, were watching the racing of those ocean greyhounds out to sea. They were now out of sight of land, and still some of the planes followed them. A half hour passed, and then the American pilots, in obedience to the radio signals, turned back from the strange phenomena of the ghost column of capital ships. Simultaneously, out of the sky dead ahead, dropped the first flight of Moyen's aerosubs. At the same moment, the mysterious power which had dragged the ships to the sea was withdrawn, and the warships, with no hands to guide them, swung wherever they willed, and floated in as many directions as there were ships, under their forward momentum. There were a score of collisions. Some of the ships were in sinking condition even before the aerosubs began their labor. The remaining ships floated high out of the water because they carried no ballast. And from all sides, the aerosubs of Moyen settled to the task of destruction. Destruction which was simply a warning of what was to come. Moyen's manner of proving to the Americas the fact that he was all-powerful. The rearmost of the American aviators had looked back, had seen the first of the aerosubs drop down among the doomed ship, and immediately turned out to sea again, signaling as he did so to the interest of the other planes. And in spite of the radio warning, 100 planes answered that signal and swept back to investigate this new mystery. "They're going to their deaths," groaned the president. "Well, yes, but it saves us ordering others to death. Perhaps we may learn something of value as we watch them die," said Klieg softly. Chapter 7, Golden Oblivion. "This," said Klieg, as coldly precise as a judge pronouncing sentence of death, "will precipitate the major engagement with Moyen's forces. The fools to rush in like this when they've been warned. But even so, they're magnificent. The pilots of the aerosubs must have instantly noticed the return of the American pilots, for some of the aerosubs, which had dropped to the ocean's surface, rose again almost instantly, and swept into battle formation above the drifting hulks of the warships. The Americans were wary. They drew together like frightened chickens when a hawk hovers over them, and watched the activities of the aerosubs, every move of each one being at the same time visible and audible to the secret agents in the capital's secret room. The aerosubs which had submerged singled out their particular prey among the floating ships, and the secret agents, trying to see how each separate act of destruction was accomplished, watched the aerosub in the foreground, which happened to be concentrating on the dreadnought which had led the ghost march of warships out to sea. The aerosub circled the swaying dreadnought as a shark circles a wreck, and through the walls of the aerosub, the watchers in the secret room could see the four-man crew of the thing, grim-faced men of the Orient they plainly were, coldly concentrating on the work at hand. Their faces were those of men who were merciless, even brutal, with neither heart nor compassion of any kind for weaker ones. One man maneuvered the aerosub, while the other three concentrated on the apparatus in the nose of the hybrid vessel. "See," spoke Klieg again, "if you can tell what manner of ray they use, and how it's projected. That's your province, General Munson." From the particular secret agent named, who was an expert for war in the membership of the secret room, came a short grunt of affirmation. A few murmured words. "I'll be able to tell more about it when I see how they operate when they're flying. That black streak under the water, well, I must see it out of the water, and then—" But here General Munson ended, for the aerosub which they were especially watching had gotten into action against the dreadnought. The aerosub was motionless and submerged just off the port bow of the dreadnought, and the three men inside the aerosub were working swiftly and efficiently with the complicated but minute machinery in the nose of their transport. "It can be controlled then, this ray. Watch," said Munson, interrupting himself. From the nose of the aerosub leaped, like a streak of black lightning, that ebon agency of death, and it struck the prow of the battleship, and the prow as far aft as the well deck simply vanished from sight, disintegrated. It was as though it had never been, and for a second, so swiftly that it had happened, the water of the ocean held the impression the portion of the warship had made as an explosive leaves a crater in the soil of the earth. Then a drumming roar as the sea rushed in to claim its own, the roaring as of a Niagara, as the waters claimed the ship, rushing down passageways into the hold, possessing the warship with all the invincible, speedy might of the sea. Mingled with this roaring was the shivering, vibratory sound which Klieg had experienced in his half-dream, the The sound was so intense it fairly rocked the secret room to its furthermost cranny. And for a second the dreadnought, wounded to death, seemed to shudder, to hesitate, and then move backward as though wincing from her death blow. It was the pound of the unrushing water that did it, however. Up came the stern of the mighty ship as she started her last long plunge into the depths. But attention had been sprung to another warship, on the starboard beam of which another aerosub had taken up position. Once again the ebon streak of death from her nose, smashing in and through the warship, directly amidships, cutting her in twain as though the blank streak had been a pair of shears. Cutting her in twain as though the black streak had been a pair of shears, the warship a piece of tissue paper. Up went the prow and the stern of this one together, the water separating the two parts as it Up went the prow and stern of this one, and together, the water separating the two parts as it rushed into the gap, the broken warship went down to its final resting place. Abruptly, Professor Manuel swung back to the American planes which had come to investigate the evidences of the aerosubs, and on the screen in the middle of the battle formation to which the pilots had swept hurriedly, the secret agents could see the faces of those pilots. White as chalk with fear, mouths opening in gangling disbelief. A pale-faced youth was the first to recover. He stared around at his compatriots and plainly came through the sound signals in the secret room through the particular swift radio signal. Attack! Who will follow me against these people? His signal was very plain, and so too were the answers of the other pilots, and the heart of Pluster Krieg swelled with pride as he listened to every answering signal and counted them, discovered that every last pilot there elected to stay with this younger, to avenge their country for this contemptuous insult which had been put upon her by the attack on Hampton Roads. But into swift formation they swept, and with these planes, all planes in use were required by franchise of operating countries to be equipped for emergencies of war, swung into an echelon formation, the youthful pilot leading by mutual consent. They swept at full speed toward the warships, 4 of which had been sent to destruction, one of which had appeared to vanish so utterly in the space of a single one which had appeared to vanish so quickly and utterly in the space of a single heartbeat. So quickly that for a second or two the shape of the change they swept at full speed. They swept at full speed toward the warships, 4 of which had by this time been sent to destruction, one of which had appeared to vanish so quickly in the space of a single heartbeat that for a second or two the shape of its bulge, the bulge of the keel, was visible in the face of the deep and opally challenged aerosubs. Goodness gracious. I just keep half dozing off. I'm just really spacey today. I don't know what the deal is. And this caffeine really isn't helping me, which is a shame. Perhaps I should just try ordinary water. Maybe that'll work. Don't mind me, just pouring water. Whew. Tell you what, we're an hour and 10-ish minutes in. This is usually when we take our first break, so we'll pause the recording, unpause the recording. Here we are. I've moved around a bit, tried to wake myself up. That's what I get for reading at 8 p.m. I get a little dozy. Such is fate, unfortunately. Anyway, now that we've all woken up, gotten some stretching in, moved, all that, let's get back to the story. Muzzles of compressed air guns projected from the wingtips of the planes. Buttons were pressed which elevated the muzzles of guns arranged to fire upward from either side the fighting pits. Twin guns that were fired downward from the same central magazine, the only guns in use in the Americas which fired in opposite directions at the same time. But for a few moments the aerosubs refused combat. Their speed was terrific, dazzling. They eluded the thrusts, dives, and plunges of the American ships as easily as a swallow eludes the dive of a buzzard. It came to Prester Klieg, however, that the aerosubs were merely playing with the Americans, that when they elected to move, the planes would be blasted from the sky as easily as the warships were being erased from the surface of the Atlantic. One by one, as methodically as machines, the aerosub pilots blasted the warships into nothingness. They had their orders, and they went about their performance with a rigidity of discipline which astounded the secret agents. They'd been ordered to destroy the warships, and they were doing that first. First, they'd go on to the completion of this task, no matter how many American planes buzzed about their ears. But one by one, as the warships sank, the aerosubs, which had either sunk or erased them, made the surface, and leaped into space with a snapping back of wings that was horribly businesslike as to sound, and climbed up to take part in the fight against American planes, which must inevitably come. The last warship, cut squarely in two from stem to stern along her center, as though split thus by a bolt of lightning, fell apart like pieces of cake, and splashed down, sinking away, while the spume of the disintegration rolled back from her fallen sides in white-crested waves. It exemplifies the policies of Moyen, said Prester Klieg, for his conquest of the world is a conquest of destruction. The last aerosub took to the sky, and the Americans rushed into battle with fine disregard for what they knew must be certain death. They weren't fools exactly, they'd seen, but they hadn't really understood the manner in which those gallant old hounds of the sea had been erased from existence. But in they went, plunging squarely into the heart of the aerosub's leading formation, which formation consisted of 3 aerosubs, flying a wing and wing formation. The young American signaled with upraised hands, and the American pilots made their first move. Every plane started rolling at dazzling speed on the axis of its fuselage, while bullets spewed from the guns that fired through the propellers. Bullets smashed into the leading aerosubs with no apparent effect, though for a second it seemed that the central aerosub of the leading formation hesitated for a moment in flight. Then swift as had that black streak flashed from the nose of the aerosub submerged, a streak darted from the nose of the central aerosub and glistened to the sun like molten gold. It touched the youngster, who had called for volunteers for his attack against the strange enemy. It touched his plane, and the plane vanished instantly, while for a fraction of a second the pilot was visible in his place in a posture of sitting, hand on a row of buttons which didn't exist, head forward slightly as he aimed guns that had vanished. And the pilot, still living, apparently unhurt, plunged down 8,000 feet to the sea. The water geysered up as he struck and then closed over the spot, and the gallant American youngster had become the first victim in the Battle of the Monsters of Moyen. Victim of a slender lancet of what seemed to be golden lightning.
He could have killed the pilot aloft there,
came quietly from Munson.
but he chose to pull his plane away from around him. Their control of that ray is miraculous.
As though to confirm the statement of Munson, the leading aero sub struck again a second plane, and the plane once again vanished. But from the spot from which it had flown, not even a bit of metal or of man sufficiently large to be seen by the delicate recording instruments of Maniel dropped out of the sky. The ray of gold was a ray of oblivion, if the minions of Moyen willed. Chapter 8. Charmian
Prester Klieg.
Came suddenly into the secret room, the voice of far distant Moyen.
You will at once make a change in your rules regarding the admission of other than secret agents to the secret room. You will see at once that Charmian Kane, sister of your friend, is allowed to enter.
A cry of agony rang from the lips of Prester Klieg. He'd not forgotten Charmian, but simply had to move so swiftly that he'd put her out of his mind. For a year he had not seen her, and an hour or two more could not matter greatly.
And her brother Carlos, see that he too is admitted. I wish for certain reasons that Charmian come unharmed through the direct attack I'm about to make against your country. I confess that save for this ability to speak to you, I am unable to work any damage to the secret room, which is therefore the safest place for Charmian Kane. Carlos Kane is being spared because he is her brother.
There was no mistaking the import of the sinister command from Moyen. He'd singled out Charmian, the best beloved of Prester Klieg, for his intentions, and that he was so sure of the success of his attack against the United Americas was proved by the calm assurance of his voice, and the fact that, concentrating on the attack he must be, he still found time for a thought of Charmian Kane. The hand of ice, which had seldom been absent from the heart of Klieg since he'd first seen and heard the voice of Moyen, gripped him anew. Blood pounded maddeningly in his temples, and cold sweat bathed his body. But the rest of the secret agents, save to freeze into immobility when the hated voice spoke, gave no sign. They had worries of their own. No instructions had been given that they bring their own loved ones into the sanctuary of the secret room. And as though answering the thoughts of the others, the hated voice spoke again.
I regret I cannot arrange for sanctuary. For the loved ones of all of you. You are all gallant antagonists. Why save the few when the many must perish? I know you will not surrender. However much I have proved to you that I am invincible, but Charmian Kane must be saved.
Then spoke General Munson.
I think this ray which the Moyanites use is a variation of the principle used in the intricate machinery of Manuel. Though how they render it visible I do not know. But it doesn't matter, it may be only a blind. You'll note that when the black streak or the golden ray strikes anything, that thing instantly disintegrates. A certain pitch of resonance will break a pane of glass, so it's a matter of vibration solely, wherein the molecules composing any object, animate or inanimate, are hurled in all directions instantaneously. Professor Manuel's apparatus, the vibration, it recaptures vibrations that are speeding outward endlessly through space, and to reconstruct and draw back to visibility the objects destroyed by this visible vibratory ray, whatever it is. This problem, it falls into the province of Professor Manuel.
Through the heart and soul of Prester Klieg there suddenly flowed a great surge of hope. Munson, if you operate the machinery that Professor Manuel has built, I wish to speak with him. Instantly, efficiently, without a word in reply to the eager command of Klieg, General Munson relieved Professor Manuel at the apparatus which Manuel had called the vibration retarder. His invention which he had combined with his audible teleview to complete this visual miracle of the secret room. Professor Manuel stepped to where Prester Klieg was sitting. Also, just as a note, I'm going to call it the vibration decreaser, as that second word has taken on a different meanings since this book's publishing in 1920, unfortunately. So, just a note. Mr. Klieg put his fingers to his lips for silence, and an expression of surprise crossed the wrinkled, dead white face of the professor. But before Klieg could speak, however, there came a signal from somewhere outside the secret room, a signal which said the doors were being opened and that a personage was coming. The secret agents looked right at one another in surprise, for every man who had a right to be inside the secret room was already present. I know. It's Charmian, Carlos Kane. Moyen, he's managed to make sure of the obedience to his orders. The agents turned back to the screen, upon which the view of the first aerial brush of the American flyers, with the minions of Moyen and their aerosubs, was drawing to a terrible close. For as the aerosub commanders had played with the warships, which had no human beings aboard them, so now did they play with the planes of the Americas. One American flyer, startled into a frenzy by the fate of his fellows, put his helicopter into action and leaped madly out of the midst of the battle. Instantly, an aerosub zoomed skyward after him. Again that golden streak of light from the nose of an aerosub, and the helicopter vanes and the slender staff upon whose tip they whirled vanished, shorn short off above the vane grooves in the top of the wing. The plane dropped away, fluttering like a falling leaf for a moment, before the aviator started his 3 propellers again. A cheer broke from the lips of Prester Klieg as he watched. The commander of that particular aerosub, apparently contemptuous of this flyer who had tried to cut out of the fight, allowed him to fall away unmolested, and the American, driven berserk by the casual, contemptuous treatment accorded him by this strange enemy, zoomed the second his propellers whirred into top-speed action, and raced up the sky toward the belly of the aerosub. "If only the aerosub has a blind spot," cried Klieg. In that instant, a roaring crash sounded in the secret room as the American plane, going full speed, crashed propellers foremost into the belly of the aerosub. And the aerosub, whose brothers had seemed until this moment invincible, didn't escape the wrath of the American, though the American rode into oblivion along with it. For welded together, American plane and aerosub started the 8,000 feet plunge downward to the sea. "Watch, watch!" cried Munson. As the aerosub and the plane plunged down through the formation of fighters, the aerosub pilots saw it, and they fled in wild dismay and at top speed from their falling compatriot. Why? For a moment it wasn't apparent, and then it was. For out of the body of the doomed aerosubs came sheets of golden flame. Not the flames of fire, but the golden sheet of that streak which the aerosubs had used against the American planes, already out of the fight. The American flyer had crashed into the container, whatever it was, that harnessed the agency through which the minions of Moyen had destroyed the Stellar and the battleships from the Hampton Roads.
It's liquid then.
And it seemed to be. For a second the golden mantle, strange, awe-inspiring, bathed and rendered invisible the aerosub and the plane which had slain her. Then the golden flame vanished utterly, instantly, and in the air where there'd been nothing. The aerosub was gone, and the plane whose mad charge had erased her.
It's all back to the agency erased it. And the other aerosubs cut away from the fight to save themselves because they too carry the death and destruction within them.
Then the inner door of the secret room opened and 2 people entered. One of them, a dazzling beauty with glorious black hair and the tread of a princess, a picture of perfection, from jeweled sandals to coiffured hair, was Charmian Kane. Behind her came her brother, whose face was chalky white. But Charmian, as she crossed to Klieg and kissed him, while her eyes were luminous with love, held her head proudly high, imperious. "I know, and I'm not afraid. I know you'll prevent it." Klieg waved the 2 to chairs and turned again to Professor Manuel. On a sheet of paper he wrote swiftly, using a mode of shorthand known only to the secret agents. "Professor, can you reverse the process used in your vibration decreaser? Tell me, with your eyes. Moyen may even know this writing, and I'm sure he hears what we say here. He might even be able to see us. Professor Manuel stared and stared. I'm sorry, does that say started and stared? Wow, that's poor word choice. Whatever. The person who wrote this probably is not in a state to care. Anyway, Professor Mannion stared into the eyes of Prester Klieg, and his face grew thoughtful. He brushed his slender hand over the massive dome of his brow, and hope burned high in the heart of Prester Klieg. And then, despite Klieg's instructions to answer merely by the expression in his eyes, Professor Manuel leaned forward and wrote quickly on the piece of paper Klieg had used. 2 hours! Nothing else, no explanations, but Prester Klieg knew. Manuel believed he could do it, but he needed 2 hours in which to perfect his theory and make it workable. Klieg knew that had he been able to do it in 2 years or 2 decades, it would still have been in the nature of a miracle. But 2 hours? And Moyen said that he was preparing to attack at once. In 2 hours, Moyen, unless the Americans fought against him with every resource at their command, could depopulate half the Western world. Klieg looked back to the screen. There wasn't a single American plane in the sky above the graveyard for those vanished warships. And the aerosubs, swift flying as the wind, were racing back to the mother ship scores of miles away. Munson worked with the vibration decreaser, the sound and vision devices, ranging the sea off the coast to either side of that huge suspended fortress, which was the mother submarine of the aerosubs. And gasps of terror, though the sight was not unexpected, broke from the lips of every person in the secret room. For the super monsters of Moyen were moving to the attack. Alright, before we start Chapter 9 here, I'm curious how many chapters of this is left, because I'm not a fan of the military thing that some of these stories like to go on. And, alright, so we're on Chapter 9, and then we have Chapter 10, Chapter 11. And then it seems as though that's that, maybe. Just let me look at the table of contents again. Yeah, it sure seems like it. Alright, so if I close... Sorry, I'm just looking at the table of contents. So if I close the... Yes, so we have at least 1, 2, 3, 4 chapters of this left. Unfortunately... I mean, fortunately, if you're big on this whole, like, military drama, but I'm not, personally. But I was just curious. We have 3 to 4 chapters left. So just give me a moment to prepare for Chapter 9, Flowers of Martyrdom. Also, shoutouts to my sweet mates who are playing Fortnite very loudly while I'm trying to read. Rude. Anyway, yeah, Chapter 9. Chapter 9, Flowers of Martyrdom. For a minute the secret agents were appalled by the air of might of the deep-sea monsters of Moyen, brought bodily almost into the secret room by the activities of the General Munson and the sound and vision apparatus. And off the coast, miles away, yet looming moment by moment larger, indicating the deceptively swift speed of the monsters, were scores of the great underwater fortresses, traveling toward the coast of the United Americas in a far-flung formation. Each submarine... Oh, excuse me, sorry. They were traveling in a far-flung formation, each submarine separated from its neighbor to the right and left by something like 100 miles, with an easy cruising radius for the little aerosubs carried inside the monsters. That each submarine did carry such spawn of Satan was plainly seen, for as the great submarines moved landward, scores of aerosubs sported gleefully about the mother ships. There was no counting the number of them. 2 hours Manuel needed for his labors, which meant that for 2 hours the flower of the country's... Wow, this is a poor word choice in here and now. Which meant that for 2 hours the flower of the country's manhood must try to hold in check the mighty hordes of Moyen. See, a modern writer, if they wanted to be poetic about this, they would say that for 2 hours the straw dam of the country's fighting force must try to hold in check the mighty pulsing hordes of the mighty rushing water of the hordes of Moyen, if they wanted to be really poetic about it, which is I think what they were trying to get at, but it just doesn't word well in the here and now because, you know, manhood has taken on a different meaning. Anyway, I digress. Somewhere there, in one or the other of those monsters is Moyen himself. I know that since he wished Charmian saved for his attentions. Do your work with the apparatus, Munson, while I go out to the radio tower to broadcast an appeal for volunteers. Charmian, Carlos. Prester Klieg found that he couldn't continue. Not that it was necessary, for Charmian and Carlos knew what was in his mind. Charmian was a lady of vast intelligence, from whom life's little ironies had not been hidden. And Kane and Klieg had already discussed the activities of Moyen where women were concerned. Prester Klieg hurried to the central radio tower, and as he passed through each of the many doors leading out to the roof of the new Capitol building, the guards at the doors left to form a guard for him, at the moment the most precious man in the country, because he knew best the terrible trials which faced this country. The country was in turmoil. It seemed almost impossible. It seemed almost impossible that a whole day had passed since Prester had first entered the secret room. In the meantime, a fleet of battleships had been drawn by some mysterious agency out to sea from Hampton Road, and a fleet of fighting planes which had followed the ghost column had not returned. Newsgatherers had spread the stories, distorted and garbled across the western continents, and throughout the Western Confederacy men, women, and children lived in the throes of greatest fear that had ever gripped them. Fear held them most, because they couldn't give the cause of their fear a name, save one. And that name was Moyen. It was on the lips of everyone, and its frenzied women stilled their squalling babes with its mention. No word yet from the secret room, but Prester Klieg had scarcely appeared from it, and someone started the radio signal, which informed the frenzied, waiting world of the West that information, exact if startling, would now be forthcoming. In millions of homes and thousands of high-flying planes, listeners tuned in at the clear all hum. Prester Klieg wasted no time in preliminaries. Prester Klieg speaking. We are threatened by Moyen with scores of monster submarines, each a mothership for scores of aerosubs, combinations of aeroplanes and miniature submarines. They are moving up on our eastern coast from some secret base which we have not yet located. They are equipped with death-dealing instruments of which we have but the most fragmentary knowledge, and for 2 hours I must call upon all flyers to combat the menace, until the secret agents, especially Professor Manuel, have had opportunity to counteract the minions of Moyen. Flyers of the United Americas, in the name of our country I ask that volunteers gather on the eastern coast, each flyer proceeding at once to the nearest coast landing after dropping all passengers. Your commanders have already been named by your various organizations, as required by franchise, and the orders for movement of the entire winged armada will come from this station. However, the orders will simply be this: hold Moyen's forces at bay for a period of 2 hours at a minimum. Know that many of you go to certain death, and make your own decisions as to whether you shall volunteer. This ended. Prester Klieg, excitement mounting high, hurried back to the secret room. Now the public knew, and as the American public is given to doing, it steadied down when it knew the worst. Fear of the unknown had changed the public into a myriad-souled beast gone berserk, but now that knowledge was exact, men grew calm of face, determined, and women assumed the supporting role which down the ages has been that of brave women, mothers of men. Hey there, 1920s. Everybody's favorite. A period of silence for a time after Prester Klieg's pronouncement. As he entered the first door leading into the secret room, Carlos Kane met and passed him with a smile. You called for winged volunteers, didn't you, Clegg? You're going? Yes, it's my duty. No other words were necessary as the men shook hands. Prester Klieg went on to join the sacred room, and Carlos Kane went out to join the mighty armada, which must fight against the minions of Moyen. The words of Prester Klieg were heard by the pilots of the Skylanes. The passenger pits, equipped with self-opening parachutes which dropped jumpers in series of long falls in order to acquire swift but accurate and safe landing, they opened at intervals in long falls of 2,000 feet, stayed the fall, and then closed again, so the drops were almost continuous until the last 400 feet, and pilots, swiftly making up their minds, dropped their passengers, banked their planes, and raced to the east. Okay, that took me a bit. So if it didn't make sense, all passenger planes are equipped with a bunch of like opening and closing parachutes for every passenger that drop them for 2,000 feet and then slow them down, and then drop them for 2,000 feet, and so on and so forth until they're on the ground. All over, the American pilots dropped their passengers and their loads if their franchises called for the carrying of freight, and banked about to take part in the first skirmish with the Moyanites. Dropping figures almost darkened the sky as passengers plunged downward after the startling signal from Washington. Flowers, which were the umbrellas of chutes, opened and closed like breathing winged orchids, letting their burdens safely to earth. And clouds and fleets of airplanes came in from all directions to land, in rows and rows which were endless, wing to wing, along the eastern coast. Prester Klieg had scarcely entered the secret room than the hated voice again broke upon the ears of the machine-like secret agents.
This is madness, gentlemen. My people will annihilate yours.
But since time for speech had passed, not one of the secret agents made answer or paid the slightest heed to the warning, though deep in the heart of each and every one was the belief that Moyen spoke no more than the truth. Too, there was a growing respect for this half-god of Asia, and that he was good enough to warn them of the Holocaust that faced their country. By hundreds and thousands, wing and wing, airplanes dropped to the Atlantic coast at the closest point of contact when the signal reached them. At high altitudes, planes crossing the Atlantic turned back and returned at top speed, dropping their passengers as soon as over land. That Moyen made no move to prevent the return of flyers out over the ocean, and now coming back was an ominous circumstance. It seemed to show that he held the American flyers, all of them, in utter contempt. Prester Klieg regarded the time. It had been half an hour since Moyen... It had been half an hour since Moyen had spoken of attack. Half an hour since the monsters of the deep had started the inexorable move toward land. On the screen, the submarines were bulking larger and larger. The moments fled, until it seemed to the secret agents the great composite of shadow of them already was sleeping inland from the coast. As the coast came close ahead to the monster subs, the little aero subs, to the surprise of the secret agents, all but vanished into their respective motherships.
They have to use them. Their submarines were useless in frontal attack against the shore.
Don't be too sure about that. I've got a suspicion those submarines have tractors under their keels so they can come out on land. If this is so, then the monsters can, guarded by armor plate, penetrate to the very heart of our most populated areas before they release their subs. None of the secret agents as yet had stopped to ponder how the monsters had reached their positions, and why Moyen was attacking from the east, when the Pacific side of the continent would have appeared to be the obvious point of attack, and would have obviated the necessity. When the Pacific side of the continent would have appeared to be the obvious point of attack, and would be the obvious point of attack, and would have obviated the necessity of a long, secret undersea journey, wherein discovery prematurely may have been one of the many worries of these submarine commanders. The mere fact of the presence of the monsters was enough. What had preceded their presence was unimportant, save that their presence and their near approach to the shore undetected further proved the executive and planning genius of Moyen. 2 miles on an average off the eastern coast, the submarines laid their eggs, the aero subs, which darted from the sides of their motherships in flights and squadrons, made the surface and leapt into the sky. 5 minutes later, the signal went forth to the phalanx of volunteers. Take off. Fly east and engage the enemy. Hold him in check. And Godspeed. 1 hour had passed since Moyen's ultimatum, when the first vanguard of the American flyers, obeying the peremptory signal, took the air and darted eastward to meet the winged death harbingers of Moyen. Chapter 10. They Shall Not Pass. Prester Klieg's heartfelt desire, as the American flyers closed with the first of the aero subs, was to go out with them and aid in the attack against the Moyanites. But he knew, and it was a tacit thing, that he best served his country from the safe haven of the secret room. As he watched the scenes unfold on the screen of Manuel's genius, with the occasional glance at the somewhat mysterious but profound and concentrated labors of Manuel, Charmian Kane rose from her place and came to his side. Wide-eyed as she watched the joining of battle, she stood there, her tiny hand encased in the tense one of Prester Klieg. You'd like to be out there, I know it, but your country needs you here. I've already given Carlos. Prester Klieg tightened his grip on her hand. There was a deep, silent understanding between these two, and Klieg, in fighting against the Moyanites, realized that, even above his realization that his labors were primarily for the benefit of his country, that he really matched wits with Moyen for the sake of Charmian. Had anyone asked him whether he would have sacrificed her for the benefit of his country, it would have been a difficult question to answer. He was glad that the question was never asked. Yes, I'd like to be out there, but the greatest need for me is here. But even so, he felt as though he was betraying those intrepid flyers he was sending to sure death. And yet they volunteered. It was the only way. Manuel, a gnome-like little man with a Titan's brain, labored with his calculations, made swiftly concrete his theories, while at the sound and vision apparatus, Munson ranged the aerial battlefield to see how the tide of battle ebbed and flowed. That neither side would either give or ask quarter was instantly apparent, for they rushed head-on to meet each other, those vast opposing winged armadas at top speed, and not a single individual swerved from his course, though at least the Americans knew that death rode the skyways ahead. Then the battle was joined. Moyen's forces were superior in armament, and their sky steeds were faster, more readily maneuverable through the flying forces of Americans, in the last 5 years, who had made vast strides in aviation. But what the Americans lacked in power, they made up for in fearless courage. The plan of battle seemed automatically to work itself out. The first vanguard of American planes came into contact with the forces of Moyen, and from the noses of countless aero subs spurted that golden streak which the secret agents knew and dreaded. The first flight of planes, stretching from horizon to horizon, vanished from the sky with that dreadful surety which had marked the passing of the Stellar, and such of those warships had felt the full force of the visible ray. From Munson rose a groan of anguish. These convertible fighting planes had been the pride of the heart of the old warrior. To do him credit, however, it was the want and so terribly inevitable destruction of the flyers themselves which affected him. It was so final, so absolute, and utterly impossible to combat. Wait, snapped Klieg, for the intrepid flyers behind that vanguard which had vanished had witnessed the wholesale disintegration of the leading element of the vast armada,
and the pilots realized on the instant that no headlong rush into the very noses of the aerosubs would avail anything. The vast American formation broke into a mad maelstrom of whirling, darting, and diving planes. Every third plane plummeted downward, every second one climbed, and the remaining ships, even in the face of what had happened to the vanished first flight, held steadily to the front. In this mad, seemingly meaningless formation, they closed on the aerosubs. Without having seen the fight, the Americans were aping the action of that one nameless flyer who charged the aerosub that had been destroyed. Klieg remembered. A score of ships had been destroyed utterly above the graveyard of dreadnoughts. Yet only one aerosub, and that was quite by chance, that had been marked off in the casualty column. Death rode the heavens as American flyers went into action. For head-on flights, flyers went in at top speed, their planes whirling on the axes of fuselages, all guns going. Planes were armored against their own bullets, and they were not under the necessity of watching to see that they didn't slay their own friends. Even so, bullets were rather ineffective against the aerosubs, whose apparently flimsy, almost transparent outer covering diverted the bullets with amazing ease. It became a whirling maelstrom of ships. The monsters of Moyen had drawn first blood, if the expression may be used in an action where no blood was drawn at all, but machines and men were simply erased from existence. Hundreds of planes already gone when the second flight of ships closed with the aerosubs. Yellow streaks of death flashed from aerosub nostrils, but even as aerosub operators set their rays into motion, the American flyers in head-on charge rolled, dived, or zoomed, and kept their guns going. High above the first flight of the aerosubs, behind which another flight was winging swiftly into action, American flyers tilted the noses of their planes over and dived under full power, to sure death, though none knew it there at the moment. These aerosubs couldn't be driven from the sky by usual means, and could destroy American ships before those planes could even come to hand grips. But they, the flyers, plainly believed could be crashed out of the sky, and so, never guessing what besides death and resulting crashes they faced, the flyers above the aerosubs, even as aerosubs in rear flashed in to prevent, dived down straight at the backs of the aerosubs. In 100 places the dives of the Americans worked successfully, and the American planes crashed full and true, full power on into the backs of the flying fish. In some aerosubs, the container of the Moyen dealing agency apparently remained untouched, and aeroplanes and aerosubs, welded together, plunged down the invisible sky lanes into the sea. Underwater, some of the aerosubs were seen to keep in motion, limping toward the nearest mother submarine. "I hope," said Klieg. "The American flyers in such cases are already dead. Moyen will be a maniac in his torture. Munson, can you locate the mother sub and see if you can get an eye on Moyen?" However, only a scattered aerosub here and there went down, without the strange substance of the yellow ray being released. In most cases, upon the contact of the plane with the aerosubs and planes were instantly blotted from view by the yellow golden flames from the heart of the winged harbingers of Moyen. Golden flames, blinding in their brightness, dropping down mere shapeless blotches, then fading out to nothingness in a matter of seconds, with aerosub and aeroplane totally erased from action and from existence. The American flyers saw and knew now the manner of the death they faced, and yet all along the battlefront, not an American tried to avoid the issue and draw out the fight. A sublime, inspiring exposition of mass courage which had not been witnessed down the years since that engagement which men of the time had called the Great War. Klieg turned to look at Manuel. Drops of perspiration bathed the cheeks of the master scientist, but his eyes were glowing like coals of fire. His face was set in a white mask of concentration, and Prester Klieg knew that Manuel would find the answer to the thing he sought, if such an answer could even be found. Would the American flyers be able to hold off the minions of Moyen until Manuel was ready? The fight out there above the waters was a terrible thing, and the Americans fought and died like men inspired. And yet inexorably the winged armada of Moyen, preceded by those golden licking tongues, was moving landward.
Good heavens, look!
There was really no need for the order. Every secret agent saw, as soon as did Munson. Under the sea, just off the coast, the mother subs had touched their blunt nose against the upward shelving of the sea bottom, had touched bottom, and were slowly but surely following the underwater curve of the land up toward the surface like unbelievable antediluvian monsters out of some nightmare. Yes, those monsters of Moyen can move on land, and the aero subs can operate from them as easily as on land as underwater. Klieg regarded the time and whirled to look at Manuel. 1 hour and 40 minutes had passed since Manuel had begged for 2 hours in which to prepare some mode of effectively combating the might of Moyen. There were 20 minutes to go, yet the mother subs would be ashore dragging their sweating monstrous sides out of the deep within 10 minutes. 10 minutes ashore, and there'd be no guessing the havoc they could cause to the United Americas. "Hurry, Manuel! Hurry! Hurry!" said Prester Klieg. But he spoke the words to himself, though even had he spoken them aloud, Manuel wouldn't have heard, for Manuel, for 2 hours, had closed his mind to everything that transpired outside of his own thoughts, devoted to foiling the power of Moyen.
"My pardon,"
snapped Munson. He pointed with a shaking forefinger to one of the mother subs crawling up the slant of the ocean bed, twisted one of the little nubs of the sound and vision apparatus, and the angelic face and satanic eyes, the twisted body of Moyen, came into view. The face was calm with dreadful purpose, and Moyen stood in the heart of one of his monsters, his eyes turned toward the land, and with a gasp of terror, dreadfully afraid for the first time, Klieg turned and looked into the eyes of Charmian. "No, it'll never happen. I have faith in you." There were still 10 minutes of the 2 hours left when the mother subs broke water and started crawling inland, swiftly, surely, without faltering in the slightest as they changed their element from water to land. As though their appearance had been the signal, the aero subs in action against the first line of American planes broke out of the one-sided fight and dove for their motherships, while a handful of American planes started back for home to prepare anew to continue the struggle. Klieg gave the signal to the second monster armada, which had remained in reserve. "Do everything in your power to halt the march of Moyen's amphibians." 10 minutes to go, and Professor Manuel still labored like a titan. Alright, Chapter 11. Caucasia falls silent. I'm curious if it means, like, literally the country that used to exist called Caucasia, or are they calling the Americas Caucasia because there's a lot of white people? I don't know. We'll find out. Just give me a sec. I gotta drink some water first. I mean, it wouldn't shock me if they meant the second one, because this book is from the 1920s, so, you know, something they could have gotten away with then, which I kind of disagree with if you ask me, but I'll leave my political opinions out of things. As the scores of amphibian monsters came lumbering forth upon dry land, it became apparent why the aero subs had returned to the motherships. For a few moments out of the water, the amphibians were almost helpless, with practically no way of attack or defense, as helpless as huge turtles turned legs up. But as each aero sub entered its proper slot in the side of the mother amphibian, it was turned about and the nose thrust back into the opening, which closed down to fit tightly about the nose of the aero sub, so that those flame-breathing monsters protruded from the sides of the amphibian in many places, transforming the amphibians into the monsters with hundreds of golden-licking tongues. As with each and every aero sub in place, the amphibian started moving inland. Professor Manuel made his first move. With the tiny apparatus upon which he had been working, he stepped to the table before the sound and vision apparatus and spoke softly to his compatriots. "Gentlemen, I have finished, and it'll work effectively." Though Manuel spoke softly, it was plain to be seen that he was proud of his accomplishment, which remained only to be attached to start performance. A matter of seconds, yet during those seconds was the real might, the real power for utter devastation of Moyen fully exposed. The amphibians got under way as the airplanes of the Americans swept into the fight. From the sides of the monsters licked out those golden tongues of flame, and from the front as well. Half a dozen amphibians slipped into New York from the harbor side and started into the heart of the city. And between the time when Manuel said he was ready and the moment when he made his first active move against Moyen, a half dozen skyscrapers vanished into nothingness. The spots where they'd stood swept clear of debris as though the land had never been reclaimed from nature. None was ever destined to know how many lives were lost in that first attack of the monsters against monsters with the golden myriad tongues, but when the monsters struck in the midst of a working day, the skyscrapers were filled with office workers. And resolve struck deep into the hearts of the secret agents. If Moyen were turned back, he must be made to pay for the slaughter. A matter of seconds. Then a moment of deathly silence as Munson gave way for the screen for the gnome-like little Professor Manuel. Now, gentlemen, if my theory is correct, he said, manipulating the instruments with lightning speed as he talked, the reversion of the principle of my vibration decreaser, which captures vibrations speeding outward from the earth and transforms them once again into sound and pictures audible and visible to the human ear, this apparatus will disintegrate the monsters as our boats and planes were disintegrated. In this time I've been compelled to manipulate in this matter of time. I must not only defeat and annihilate the minions of Moyen, but work from a mathematical absurdity, so that the moment of impact of the moment itself must become part of the past, sufficiently remote to remove the monsters at such distance from the earth that not even the mighty genius of Moyen can return them. Then came the whirring, gentle as the whirring of dove's wings. In the center of the picture on the screen were those half-dozen amphibians laying waste to Manhattan, and Manuel set his intricate, delicate machinery into motion. Instantly, the amphibians out there seemed to become misty, shadowy, and to lift out of Manhattan. Above the rooftops of skyscrapers, still remaining, nebulous and wraith-like as ghost shrouds, yet swinging outward from the earth with speed almost too swift for the eye to detect. But where the amphibians had rested there stood, reclined in all sorts of postures, surprising and even a bit ridiculous, the men of Moyen who had operated the monsters of Moyen. Hang on, I just got an email and it looked important. That's why. Thank you for the follow, Alley Kits. You get a face in the cup. In it goes. Doot. That's part of the fun here. If you're following because we're doing paper cuts, good. That's what I usually do. Speaking of, tomorrow, Saturday, I am... I'm going to stream for 12 hours. I'm going to be speedrunning a game, so if the people who followed for speedruns will be very excited to see that again. But I'll be attempting to learn speedruns of a game for 12 hours tomorrow because I have no concept of time, and I like to agree on large projects, I guess. Anyway, returning to the story, we just had our triumphant moment of, haha, take that. Because we made the big angry death machines that were disintegrating a lot of stuff get absolutely dunked on. And we saved all the people inside them, so that's cool. Anyway, from the central radio tower went forth a mighty voice of command, the planes which had been engaging the aerosubs off course. Slay, slay! Down flashed the planes of the Americas, and their guns were blazing inaudibly, but none the less deadly of aim and purpose, straight into the midst of the men of Moyen, who had thus been left marooned and almost helpless with the vanishing of their amphibians. Why didn't you just vanish the dudes? That's a serious question. Why didn't you just vanish the dudes such that you didn't have to have your people fight people? Like, that's an option. Anyway. And noting how they fell in strangled, huddled heaps before the vengeful fire of the American planes, the secret agent sighed, and Manuel, his face alight with the pride of his accomplishment, switched to another point along the coast. And as a new group of the monsters of Moyen came into view, Manuel bent to his labors afresh. The hated voice of the master mobster broke once more in the secret room.
Enough, Clegg. Enough. You'll surrender to save lives. I stipulate only that my own life be spared.
To which Prester Klieg made an instant reply. Did you offer us the choice of surrender? Did you spare the lives of our people, which with your control of your golden rays you easily could have done? No, nor will we spare lives, least of all the life of Moyen. The whirring came again, as the whirring of doves' wings. More metal monsters, even as golden tongues spewed forth from their many sides, vanished from view, leaping skyward, while the operators of them were left to the mercies of the remaining airmen of the Americas. Voicelessly, the word went forth. Slay, slay. It was Charmian who begged for mercy for the vanquished. As one by one, as surely as fate, the monsters with their contained aerosubs were blotted out, leaving pilots and operators behind them. Down upon these dropped the airmen of the West, slaying without mercy. Please, spare them. Even, he began, thinking of Moyen, who would have taken Charmian. He felt a shudder as she read his mind, understood what he would have asked. There he is. No, wait, that's not the lady, that's Munson.
There he is. Brr, I'm Munson.
An amphibian had just been disintegrated, had just climbed mistily swiftly into the invisibility in the skies. And there, in the midst of the conquerors left behind, his angel's face set in a moody mask. His pale eyes awful with fear, his misshapen body sagging, terrible in its realization of failure, was Moyen. Even as Klieg prepared to give the mercy signal, the plane dived down on the group about Moyen, and the secret agents could see the hand of the pilot, lifted high as though he signals. The plane was a Mather. The pilot was Carlos Kane. Just as Kane went into action and the noiseless bullets from his ship crashed into that twisted body, causing it to jump and twitch with the sight of them, Klieg gave the signal. Even as the figure of Moyen crashed to the soil, and the man's soul quitted its mortal casement, Klieg commanded, "Spare all who surrender. Make them prisoners to be used to repair the damage they've done to our country. Guards will be instantly placed over the amphibians and the aerosubs, for the day they may come when we need to know their secrets." And his men, hands lifted high in token of surrender, quitted the now motionless amphibians, and flyers dropped down to make them prisoners. Manuel sighed, pressed various buttons on his apparatus, and the mad scene of carnage they had witnessed for hours faded slowly out, and the darkness and silence filled the secret room. But darkness is the joy of lovers, and in the midst of silence that was almost appalling by contrast, Klieg and Charmian were received into each other's arms. Come on! That line did not need to be there. I'm sorry, this is just my modern ear speaking. That last bit there, just pairing the dude and the girl in the story together, just did not need to be there at all. 0%. Like, you could easily erase the bits about Charmian and it would just be fine. It could just completely go away. There did not need to be a romance bit in this story. Anyway, I'm assuming that's the end of that story. Okay, so now the Reader's Corner? Question mark? No, the Reader's Corner is just there. That's neat. Thanks. Alright, so we've got about an hour here. It's been about 2 hours. We're going to pause the recording and we're going to put up the BRB. And everybody, get up, do a stretch, maybe grab a snack or something, cup of tea, something. Just get your blood moving. It's not good to sit for more than like an hour or so at a time, or so the internet tells me. And the internet's never wrong, is it? Anyway, we're coming back with hopefully a much better story, in my opinion, than the war story we were just listening to, as interesting as that was. Snorefest. This one, it's got a much more interesting title. It's called The Vampires of Venus by Anthony Poucher. So we'll be right back and come back with that. It was as if someone had thrown a bomb into a Quaker meeting, when adventure suddenly began to crowd itself into the life of the studious and methodical Leslie Larner, professor of entomology. Fame had been his since early manhood when he began to distinguish himself in several sciences, but the adventure and thrills he'd longed for had always fallen to the lot of others. His father, a college professor, had left him a good working brain and nothing else. Later, his mother died and he was left with no relatives in the world, so far as he knew, so he gave his life over to study and hard work. And yet, still youthful at 25, he was hoping that fate would give him a break. And it just so happened it did. He was in charge of a government department having to do with Japanese beetles, Hessian flies, boll weevils, and such, and it seemed that his life had just been one bug after another. He took creeping, crawling things seriously and believed that unless curbed, insects would someday crowd man off the earth. He sounded an alarm, but humanity wasn't very disturbed. So Larner fell back on his microscope and concerned himself with saving cotton, wheat, and other crops. His only diversion was fishing for the elusive rainbow trout. He managed to spend a month each year in the Colorado Rockies angling for speckled beauties. Larner was anything but a clock watcher, but on this certain bright day in June, he was seated in his laboratory doing, well, just that. Just 5 minutes to go, he mused. It was 4:25 p.m. He'd finished his work, put his affairs in order. In 5 minutes he'd be free to leave on a much-needed and well-earned vacation. His bags were packed in at the station, and his fishing tackle, the pride of his young life, was neatly rolled in oiled silk, and stood near at hand. I'll just fill my calabash, take one more quiet smoke, and then off to the mountains in freedom, he told himself. And he settled back with his feet on his desk. He had half closed his eyes in solid comfort, and then the bomb fell and exploded. Hang on, there's a buzzer sounding on his desk. You know what that means? I gotta make my phone vibrate. I can do that. Just timer for 5 seconds. Start. No, not 5 minutes and 5 seconds. Cancel. No minutes and 5 seconds. Can I do that? Oh, it's not vibrating. Good. The buzzer at his desk buzzed, and his feet came off the desk and hit the floor with a thud. His eyes popped open, and the calabash was immediately laid aside. That buzzer usually meant business, and it would be just his usual luck to have trouble crash in on him just as he was on the edge of a rainbow trout paradise. A messenger was ushered into the room by an assistant. The boy handed him an envelope, said no answer, and then departed. Lorna tore open the envelope lazily. He read and then reread its contents, while a look of puzzled surprise disturbed his usually placid countenance. He spread the sheet of paper out on his desk, and for the 10th time he read, "Confidential. Memorize this address and destroy this paper. To Labella, 1726 88th Street, West. City of Hesper, Republic of Pana, Planet Venus. Will meet you in the frying pan." That was all. It was enough, though. Lerner lost his temper, and he crumpled the paper, tossing it in the wastebasket. He was not given to profanity, but he would say golly gosh in a way that sizzled. Golly gosh. Anyone who would send a man a crazy bunch of nonsense like that at a time like this ought to be snuffed out like a beetle. "Meet you in the frying pan," he quoted, and then he happened to recall something. By golly, there is a fishing district in Colorado known as the Frying Pan. That's not so crazy, but the Planet Venus part surely is cuckoo. He fished the paper out of the wastebasket, found the envelope, placed the strange message within, and put it inside his coat pocket. Then he seized his suitcase and fishing tackle, and rushing out, hailed a taxi. Not long after, he was on his way west by plane. As the country unrolled under him, he retrieved the strange note from his pocket. He read it again and again. Then he examined the envelope. It was an ordinary one of good quality, designed for business rather than one's social usage. The note paper appeared quite different. It was unruled, pure white, and of a texture which might be described as pebbly. It was strongly made and of a nature unlike any paper Larner had ever seen before. It seemed to have been made from a fiber rather than a pulp. I wonder who wrote it. It's beautiful handwriting, masculine, yet artistic. Wonder where he got the frying pan idea. At any rate, I'm not going to the frying pan this year. I'm camping on Tennessee Creek in Lake County, Colorado. The country there is more beautiful and restful. But there is this address on the planet Venus. Seems to me I read somewhere that Marconi had received mysterious signals he believed came from the planet Venus. Hesper, it sounds familiar. Wonder if there could be anything to it. Something impelled him to follow out the instructions in the note. He spent the last few hours repeating the address over and over again, and when he was satisfied that he'd memorized it thoroughly, he tore the strange paper into bits and set it fluttering earthward like a tiny snowstorm. Larner wasn't a gullible individual, but neither was he unimaginative. He was a scientist enough to know that the impossibilities of today are the accomplishments of tomorrow. So while not convinced that the note was a serious communication, he kept his mind open. The weird address insisted on creeping into his mind and driving out other thoughts, even those of his speckled playfellows, the rainbow trout. I've a notion to plane my chance. Yes. I've a notion to change my plans and go from Denver to the frying pan. He cogitated, and then thought, no, I won't take it that seriously. Anyone who knows the Colorado Rockies knows paradise. There's no more beautiful country on the globe. Lake County, where Larner had chosen his fishing grounds, has as its seat the old mining camp of Leadville. It had been visited and settled, more for its gold mines than the golden view of sunsets above the clouds, but the gold of sunsets is eternal, while the gold of the mines is, well, quickly fading away, to put it lightly. Leadville, with its 5,000 inhabitants, nestles above the clouds at an altitude of more than 10,000 feet. Mount Massive, with its 3 peaks, lies back of the town in panorama, and rises to a height of some 14,400 feet. In the rugged mountains thereabouts are hundreds of lakes fed by wild streams and bubbling crystal springs. All those lakes are above the clouds. Winter sees the whole picture decorated with bizarre snowdrifts from 20 to 40 feet deep, but spring comes early. The beautiful columbines and crocuses bloom before the snow is all off the ground in the valleys. The lands up to 12,000 feet altitude are carpeted with a light green grass and moss. Giant pines and dainty aspens, with their silvery bark and pinkish leaves, blossom forth and whisper, while the eternal snows still linger on the higher rocky cliffs and peaks above. Indian paint blooms its blood red in contrast to the milder colorings. Blackbirds and bluebirds chatter and chipmunks chirp. The gold so hard to find in the mines just glares at you from the skies. The hills cuddle in banks of snowy clouds, and above all, a clear blue sky paints its picture over the top. The lakes and streams abound with rainbow trout, the gamiest of any freshwater fish. It's indeed a paradise for either poet or sportsman. In any direction near to Leadville, a man can find heaven and recreation and rest. Finding himself on Harrison Avenue, the main street of the county seat, Larner, after reviewing some old acquaintanceships, started west in a flivver for Tennessee Creek. The flivver is a modern adjustment. Until a few years ago, the only means of traversing these hills were by patient, sure-footed donkeys, which carried the pack while the wayfarer walked along beside. And the first day's fishing was good. The trout seemed to greet him cheerily and sprang eagerly to the fray. They bit at any sort of silken fly he cast. The site chosen by Larner for his camp was in a mossy clearing, separated from the stream by a fringe of willows along the creek. Then came a border of aspens, backed by a forest of silver-tipped firs. It was ideal, and his eyes swept the scene with satisfaction. Then he began whittling bacon to grease his pan for frying trout over the open fire. Suddenly he heard a rustle. Suddenly he heard a rustle in the aspens, and looking up, beheld a picture which made his eyes bulge. A man and a woman, garbed seemingly in the costumes of another world, walked toward him. Neither were more than 5 feet tall, but were physically perfect and marvelously pleasing to the eye. There was little difference in their dress. Both wore helmets with what Garner believed to be sapphires, but he learned later that they were diamonds. Their clothing consisted of tight trouser-like garments surmounted by tunics of some white pelt resembling chamois, save for color. A belt studded with precious stones encircled their waist, and artistic laced sandals graced their small, firm feet. Their skin was a pinkish white, and their every feature was perfection plus. Their bodies curved just enough wherever a curve should be. The woman was daintier and more fully developed, and her features were even more finely chiseled than the man. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to distinguish them. Larner took in these details subconsciously, for he was still awed beyond expression. All he could do was to stand seemingly frozen, half bent over the campfire with his frying pan in hand. And then the man spoke.
I hope we didn't startle you. I thought my note would partly prepare you for this meeting. We expected to find you in the frying pan district. When you didn't appear there, we tuned our radio locator to your heartbeats, and in that way located you here. You were hardly a second space flying time from where we were.
Larner said nothing. He could really only stand and gape.
I do not wonder that you are surprised,
said the strange little man.
I'll explain that I am Nern Bella, of the city of Hesper on the planet Venus. This is my sister Tula. We greet you in the interest of the Republic of Pana, which embraces all of the planet you know as Venus.
When Larner recovered his breath, he lost his temper. I don't know what circus you escaped from, but I crave solitude and I have no time to be bothered with fairy tales. Expressions of hurt surprise swept the countenances of his visitors, and the man spoke again. We are what we assert we are, and our finding you is made necessary by a condition which grieves the souls of all the 900 million inhabitants of Venus. We've come to plead with you to come with us, and use your scientific knowledge to thwart a scourge which threatens the lives of millions of people. There was a quiet dignity about the man, and an air of pride about the woman, which made Larner stop and think, or at least try to. He rubbed his hand over his brow and looked questioningly at the pair. If you are what you say you are, how did you get here?
We came in a Targo, a space flying ship capable of doing 426,000 miles an hour. This is just 1,200 times fast as 355 miles an hour, the highest speed known on your Earth. Come with us, and we will show you our ship.
They looked at him appealingly, and both smiled a smile of wistful friendliness. Larner, without a word, threw down his frying pan and followed them through the aspens. The brother and sister walking ahead of him gave his eyes a treat. He surveyed the perfect form of the girl, and her perfection was beyond his ken. See, the way that was worded, I thought he was going to survey both of the forms, like, hello. But no, this is the 1920s, so, alas, he's only got eyes for the gal. I mean, he did describe both of them. He did describe both of them as giving his eyes a treat. Maybe he just likes gals a little better. You don't know. I won't assume. They're certainly not of this world, he mused. A few hundred yards further on there was a beach of pebbles, where the stream had changed its course. On this plot sat a gigantic spherical machine of a glass-like material. It was about 300 feet in diameter, and it was tapered on two sides into T's, which Larner rightly took to be lights.
This is a Targo, our type of space flyer. It's capable of making 2 trips a year between Venus and the Earth. We visited this planet often, always landing in some mountain or jungle vastness, as heretofore we did not desire Earth dwellers to know of our presence.
Why not? Asked Larner, his mouth agape and his eyes protruding, His mind was so full of questions he fairly blurted this first one. Because our race knows no sickness and we feared contagion, your race has not yet learned to control its being.
Oh,
Said Larner, thoughtfully. He realized that humans of the earth, whom he'd always regarded as God's most perfect beings, weren't exactly so perfect after all. How do you people control your being, as you express it? It's simple. For 90 centuries we've ceased to breed imperfection, crime, and disease. We deprive no one of the pleasures of life, but only the most perfect mental and physical specimens of our people care to have children. In other words, while we make no claim to controlling our intimate habits, we do control the results.
oh.
Said Larner again. Nernbella led the way to the door, which opened into the side of the space flyer near its base.
We have a crew of 4 men and 4 women.
They handle the entire ship, with my sister and I in command, making us 6 souls aboard in all. Why men and women? Thought Larner, and as if in answer to his thought, Bella said, On the earth, the 2 sexes have struggled for supremacy, and this has thrown your civilization out of balance. On Venus, we struggled for this equality and accomplished it. It's a perfect balance. Man and woman engage in all endeavor and share all favors and rewards alike.
In war as well?
Asked Larner. There has not been war on Venus for 600,000 years. There's only the one nation, and the people all live in perfect accord. Our only trouble in centuries is this dire peril which now threatens our people. It's this I wish to talk to you more at length. They were standing close to the Targo, and Larner was struck by the peculiar material of which it was constructed. There was a question in his eyes, and Nernbella answered it. The metal is geranium. It's metallized quartz of a sort. It's frictionless, conducts no current or ray except the repulsion and attraction rays NTR69X6 by which it is propelled. Practically transparent, lighter than air, and harder than diamond. It's cast in molds after being melted, or I suppose fused would be the right word. We use cold light, which we produce by forcing oxygen through air tubes into a vat filled with the fat of a deep-sea fish resembling your whale. You're aware, of course, that is exactly how cold light is produced by the firefly, except for the fact that the firefly uses his own fat. Fun fact, that is actually roughly how fireflies work. There are 2 enzymes called luciferin and luciferase, and the firefly produces luciferin, which metabolizes with luciferase to produce the light. And it takes ATP to make the luciferin, so it does roughly use its own fat to do that. It's not completely incorrect. Larner was positively fascinated. He smoothed the metal of the Targo in appreciation of its marvelous construction, but he longed most to see this strange light-giving mechanism, for this was closer to his own line of entomology. He had always believed that the light-giving organs of fireflies and deep-sea fishes could be reproduced mechanically. Actually, I'm kind of shocked that we haven't done that, us humans. It's curious. I'm just curious if it's even possible. But anyway, I digress. The interior of the ship resembled in a vague way that of the ocean liner. It was controlled by an instrument board at which a man and a girl sat, and they didn't raise their heads as the 3 people entered.
Hang on, I gotta digress on this firefly question, because if we produce artificial luciferin luciferase reaction lights, would we have to feed them things? Would it I think there are bacteria that can produce ATP from electricity directly, right? So, in theory, we could use the electricity ATP bacteria that they get electricity, like om-nom, out of the grid, like normal lights. And then they spit out ATP, and then that ATP, which is just hanging out, could be used to metabolize the luciferin luciferase, and then we would have a lot less heat output
compared to any other bulb except, like, well, actually, yeah, just generally a lot less heat output, like, even maybe more so than LEDs, but it's a question of, like, is that going to be more efficient? I mean, like, the big thing is, like, those, you wouldn't really have to replace them, would you? As long as, like, the bacterium are still alive, and I mean, like, as long as those bacterium have electricity, they should live, so, you know, I mean, like, it may not actually be slightly more efficient if, like, if it constantly needs to be drawing electricity, even if it's off. I'm curious. Like, because it would always have to be on because the bacteria need to be living, so they need to keep getting electricity, and that always makes the glow happen. So, like, turning those lights on and off would actually be a matter of closing them off from things. I don't know. It's just a thought. But it's a curious thought, and I'm curious to, like, Google it afterward. If someone knows anything, post in the comments of this recording. You know, like, link me an article. Well, I would say link me an article, but I think I have links banned in my comments. Just email me, like, an article or something. You know, just talk to me about it. It's cool. Anyway, I digress. They were talking about how they had lights that work in the same way as fireflies and deep ocean fish. And then they walked into the alien spaceship, and the three people that were chilling in the spaceship doing, like, important instrument things the people chilling in the spaceship doing important instrument things were not amused by the people. When called by Bella and his sister, who seemed to give commands in unison, the crew assembled and were presented to the visitor. "Earth dwellers are not the curiosity to us that we seem to be to you," said Tulabella, speaking for the first time and smiling sweetly, even though I accidentally gave her voice. Wait, no, that's the lady. "Earth dwellers are not the curiosity to us that we seem to be to you," said Tulabella, speaking for the first time and smiling sweetly. Larner, however, was too engrossed to note the remark further than to nod his head. He was lost in the contemplation of these strange people, all garbed exactly alike and all surpassingly lovely to look upon. An odor of food wafted from the galley, and Larner remembered he was hungry with the hunger of health. He swung his basket of fish over his shoulder when he left his campfire, and Tula took it from him. "Would you like to have our chef prepare them for you?" Ooh. Jeez, my voice is not happy with the lady voice today. "Would you like to have our chef prepare them for you?" she said as she caught his hungry glance at his day's catch, and this time Larner actually answered her. "If you will pardon me, really I am famished. "You won't miss your fish dinner." "I believe there's enough for all of us. I caught 20 of the beauties. I never knew fish to bite like that. Why, they..." And he was off on a voluminous discourse on a favorite subject. Those assembled listened sympathetically, and then Tula took the fish, and soon the aroma of broiling trout, mingled with other entrancing galley odors. After dinner, at which some weird yet satisfying viands... Hey everybody, it's the world's loudest toilet! After a dinner at which some weird yet satisfying viands were served and much unusual conversation indulged in, Nur and Bella led the way to what appeared to be the captain's quarters. The crew and their visitor sat down to discuss a subject which proved to be such a terrifying nature as to scar human souls. "People on Venus," said Nern as his eyes took on a worried expression, "are unable to leave their homes after nightfall, due to some strange nocturnal beast which attacks them and vampirishly drains all blood from their veins, leaving the dead bodies limp and empty." "What? How?" questioned Larner, leaning far forward over the conference table. The others nodded their heads, and in the eyes of the women there was terror. Also the eyes of the men, I'd assume, since they have, equality. Larner could not but believe this. "The beasts, or should I say insects, are as large as your horses, and they actually fly, by night, striking down humans, domestic animals, and all creatures of warm blood. How many there are, we have no means of knowing, and we cannot find their hiding and breeding places. They're not native to our planet, and where they come from, we cannot imagine. They're actually monstrous flies or bugs or some sort of insect, so they're basically giant mosquitoes. Okay, cool. Leonard was overcome by incredulity and showed it. Insects as big as horses? He questions and can hardly suppress a smile. Believe us in the name of the God of us all. They have a mouth which consists of a large suction disc, in the center of which is a lance-like tongue. The lance is forced into the body at any convenient point, and the suction disc drains out the blood. If only we knew their source. They attack young children in the aged up to 500 years alike. Wait, 500 years? I should have explained. The Venus dwellers, due to our advanced knowledge of sanitation and health conservation, they live about 800 years and then die invariably of old age. The only unnatural cause of death encountered is this giant insect, at least as of late. Accidents do occur, of course, but they're rare. There are no deliberate killings on Venus. Larner didn't answer, he only pondered. The more he ran over the strange happenings of the week in his mind, the more he believed he was dreaming. His thoughts took a strange turn. Why do these vain people go around dressed in jeweled ornaments? Nern again anticipated his question. Diamonds, gold, and many of what you call precious stones are common on Venus. And talc and many other things are more valuable. Talc? Yes, we use an immense quantity of it. We have a wood that is harder than your steel, and we build machinery with it. However, we can't use oil to lubricate these wooden pieces, as it softens the wood, so all parts exposed to friction are sprayed constantly by a gust of talc from a blower. You, however, use talc mostly for toilet purposes, and we use it for a great number of larger purposes. There's a little left on Venus, and it's more valuable to us than either gold or diamonds. We draw on your planet now for talc. You dump immense quantities. We just shipped 101,000-ton globes of it from the Cripple Creek district, and the district never missed it. We drew most of it from your mine dumps. Nern tried not to look bored as he explained more in detail. We brought 100 hollow spheres constructed of duranium. We suspended these over the Cripple Creek district at an altitude of 10,000 feet above the Earth's surface. Because of the crystal glint of duranium, they were invisible to Earth dwellers at that height. Then we used a suction draft at night, drawing the talc from the Earth, filling one drum after the other. This is done by tuning in a certain selective attraction that attracts only talc. It draws right out of the ground in tiny particles and assembles it in the transportation drums as pure talc. On the Earth, if noticed at all, it would be called a dust storm. The drums, when loaded with talc, are set to attract the proper planetary force, and they go speeding towards Venus at the rate of 426,000 miles an hour. They are prevented from colliding with meteors by an automatic magnetic device. This is controlled by magnetic force alone, and when the Targo gets too close to a meteor, it changes its course instantly. The passenger Targo we ride in acts similarly. And now may I return to the subject of vampires of Venus? Oh, pardon my ignorance. Yes, continue, said Larner, and for the first time in his life felt very ignorant indeed. I know little more than I have told you, said Nern rather hopelessly. Our knowledge of your world, your people, and your language comes from our listening in on you and observing you without being observed or heard. This may seem like taking advantage of you, if not for the fact that we respect confidences and subjugate all else to science. We've helped you at times by telepathically suggesting ideas to your thinkers, actually. We'd have given you all our inventions in this way gladly, but in many instances we were unable to find minds attuned to accept such advanced practices. We have had the advantage of you because our planet is so many millions of years older than your own. There was a plaintive note in Nern's voice as he talked. Question of the day, what's plaintive mean? No, not millions. I want to know about plaintive. Plaintive, rather. sounding sad and mournful. But now we are on our knees to you, so to speak. We don't know everything, and desperately we need the aid of a man of your caliber. On behalf of the distraught people of Venus, I'm asking you bluntly to make a great sacrifice. Will you face the dangers of a trip to Venus, and use your knowledge to aid us in exterminating these creatures? There was positive pleading in his voice, and in his eyes of his beautiful sister there were tears. But what would my superiors in the government bureau think? I couldn't explain. You have no superiors in your line. Our government needs you at this time more than any other earthly government. Your place here is a fixture. You can always return to it should you live. We're asking you to face a horrible death with us. You can name your own compensation, but I know you're not interested so much in reward. Now, honestly, my good professor, there's no advantage to be gained by explanation. Just disappear. In the interest of science and the salvation of people who are at your mercy, just drop out of sight. Drop out of life on this planet. Come with us. The cause is worthy of the man I believe you to be. Well, I suppose I'll go then, said Larner, and his host waited no more. An instant later the Targo shot out into interstellar space. How do you know what course to follow? Asked Larner after a reasonable time, when he'd recovered from his surprise at the sudden takeoff. We don't need to know. Our machine is tuned to be attracted by the planetary force of Venus alone. We couldn't go elsewhere. A repulsion ray finds us as we near Venus, and protects us against too violent a landing. We'll land on Venus like a feather about 3 months from tonight. The time of the journey through outer space was of little moment, save for one small incident. Larner and the other travelers were suddenly and rather rudely jostled about the rapidly flying craft. Larner lost his breath, but not his speech. What happened? We just automatically dodged a meteor. Most of the time of the trip was spent by Larner in listening to explanations of customs and traditions of the people of the brightest planet in the universe. There was a question Larner desired to ask Bella, but he hesitated to do so. Finally, one evening during the journey to Venus, when the travelers had been occupying themselves in a scientific discussion of comparative evolution on the two planets, Larner saw his opportunity. Why did the people of Venus remain so small? Why didn't you strive for more height? As an example, there's plenty of people on my planet. They've always wanted to be tall, you know. Without meaning any offense, I must say that it's characteristic of Earth dwellers to want something without knowing any good reason why they want it. It's perfectly all right for your good people to be tall, but for us it's not so fitting. You see, Venus is smaller than the Earth. Size is comparative. You think we're not tall because you are used to taller people. Comparatively, we're tall enough. In proportion to the size of our planet, we are exactly the right size. We keep our population at 900 million, and that's perfectly the exact number of people who can live comfortably on our planet. Arriving at Venus, Larner was assigned a laboratory and office in one of the government buildings, and it was a world made seemingly of glass. Quartz of rose, white, and crystal coloring, Larner found was the commonest country rock of the planet. In many cases it was shot full of splinters of gold, which the natives had not taken the trouble to recover. This quartz was of a terrific hardness and was usually used in the building, paving, and public works generally. The effect was bewildering. It was a world of shimmering crystal. The atmosphere of Venus had long puzzled Larner. While not an astronomer in the largest sense of the word, he had a keen interest in the heavens as a giant puzzle picture, and had given some spare time to the study. Sorry, I had a yearbook bit on my tongue. He knew from all indications that Venus had a most unusual atmosphere. Dang it. I didn't get the yerba bit. There we go. Now I got the yerba leaf out of my face. Anyway. He knew from all indications that Venus had a most unusual atmosphere. He'd read that the atmosphere was considerably denser than that of the Earth, and that its presence made observation difficult. The actual surface of the planet, he knew, could hardly be seen, either due to this atmosphere or seemingly perpetual cloud banks. He'd read that the presence of atmosphere surrounding Venus is indicated to earthly astronomers during the planet's transit by rings of light due to the reflection and scattering of collected sunlight by its atmosphere. Astronomers on Earth, he knew, had long been satisfied of the presence of great cloud banks, as rocks and soils could not have had such high reflecting power. He knew that, like the moon, Venus, when viewed from the Earth, presents different phases from the crescent to the full or total stage. Looking up at the sky from the quartz streets of Venus, Larna beheld, in sweeping grandeur, massed cloud banks, many of them apparently rain clouds. Nern noted. Dang. Alright. Nern noted his skyward gaze and said, "We've accomplished meteorological control. Those clouds were brought under control when we conquered interplanetary force, rather what you call gravity. We form them and move them at will. They are our rain factory. We make rain and when and where we will. This ensures our crops and makes for health and contentment. The air, you will note, is about the same or a little more moist than the earth air at the sea level. This is due to the planet's position near the sun. We've been striving for the centuries to make the air a little drier and more rare, but without success. The heavy content of disintegrated quartz in our soil makes moisture very necessary for our crops, so our moist atmosphere is evidently a provision of Providence. We're used to breathing this moist air, and when I first visited the Earth, I was made uncomfortable by your rarefied atmosphere. Now I can adjust myself to breathing the air of either planet. However, I find myself drinking a great deal more water on Earth than on Venus." In the fairyland which had enjoyed centuries of peace, health, and accord, stark terror now reigned. Some instances, the finely bred, marvelously intelligent people were in a mental condition bordering on madness. This was especially true in the farming districts, where whole herds of lats had been wiped out. Lats, Larner gleaned, were a common farm animal, similar to the bovine species on Earth, only more woolly. On these creatures, the Venus dwellers depended for their milk and dairy supplies and for their warmer clothing, which was made from the skin. The hair was used for brushes in the building trades and 1,000 ways in manufacturing. Besides the domestic animals, hundreds of people continued to meet death, and only a few of the flying vampires had been hunted down. The giant insects were believed to breed slowly as compared to Earth insects, their females producing not more than 10 eggs by estimate, after which death overtook the adult. In spite of this, they were reported to be increasing. In the government building, Larner was placed in touch with all the government scientists of Venus. His nearest collaborator was one Zorn Zeta, most profound scientist of the planet. The two men, with a score of assistants, worked elbow to elbow on the most gigantic scientific mystery in the history of the two planets. A specimen of the dread invader was mounted and studied by the scientists, who were so engrossed in their work they hardly took time to eat. As for sleep, there was little of it. Days were spent in research, and night spent in hunting the monsters. This hunting was done by newly recruited soldiers and scientists. The weapons used were a short ray gun of high destructive power, which disintegrated the bodies of the enemies by atomic energy blasts. The quarry was wary, however, and struck at isolated individuals rather than massed fighting lines. Seated at his workbench, Larner asked Zorn Zeta what had become of Nern Bella. In his heart he had a horrible lurking fear that Tula Bella might have fallen before a swarm of strange vampires, but he didn't voice this anxiety. Nern and his sister are explorers and navigators. They've been assigned to carry you anywhere on this or any other planet where your work may engage you. They await your orders. They're too valuable as space navigators to be placed in harm's way. Breathing a sigh of relief, Larner bent to his labors. What other wild animals or harmful insects have you on this planet? I get your thought. You're seeking a natural enemy to this flying menace, right? Yes. All the insects left on Venus, with this one exception, are beneficial. There are no wild animals and no harmful insects. All animals, insects, and birds have been domesticated and are fed by their keepers. We get fabrics from forms of what you call spiders and other web builders and cocoon spinners. All forms of birds, beasts, crawling and flying things have been brought under the dominion of man, or I suppose Venusian. We'll have to seek out another way than by finding an enemy parasite.
Where do you think these insect invaders came from?
You've noticed they're unlike anything you have on Earth in anatomical construction. They partake of the general features of the Coleoptera, a beetle, in that they wear a sheath of armor, yet their mouth parts are more on the order of a diptera as in a fly. I regard them more as a fly than a beetle, because most Coleoptera are beneficial to humanity, while practically, if not all, diptera are malignant. As to their original planet, I believe they migrated here from some under the planet.
They couldn't fly through space, though.
No, that's the mystery of it, how they got here and what breed they are. That's the questions we have to answer.
Long days passed on Venus, long days and sleepless nights. The big insects were hunted nightly by men armed with ray guns, and nightly the blood-sucking monsters took their toll of humanity and animals. And finally, Larner and Zorn determined to capture one of the insects alive, muzzle its lance and suction pad, and give it sufficient freedom to find its way back to its hiding place. By following the shackled monster, the scientists hoped to find the breeding grounds. All the provinces of the planet joined in the drive. Men turned out in automatic vehicles, propelled by energy gathered from the atmosphere. They came on foot in an aircraft. Mobilization was at given points, and leading the van were Zorn and Larner and their confreres.
That doesn't sound like a real word. What's it mean?
Yep. Confreres.
No, not leading. Tell me about confreres. Canfer. Anyway, Canfer, a fellow member of a profession or a colleague. Anyway, mobilization was at given points, and leading the van were Zorn and Larner and their Canfer in the Targo of the Nern and Tulabella. The great army of Venus carried giant searchlights and was armed with deadly ray guns. Headquarters of the vast army of offense was in the Targo of the Bellas. Larner was in supreme command, and just before the big army set out to scour the planet to seek the breeding place of the monsters, Larner issued a bulletin that was set all Venus by the ears. Addressed to the President Volvest of the Republic of Pana and the good people of Venus, it read,
As is generally known, it has been the habit of the nation's space-flying merchantmen to visit the sunlit side of the planet Mercury to obtain certain rare woods and other materials not found on this planet. One side of Mercury, as is known, is always turned from the sun, and is in a condition of perpetual darkness. In this perpetual darkness and dampness, where many rivers flow into warm black swamps, the vampires may have bred for centuries. Conditions were ideal for their growth, and so through the ages they evolved into the monsters we've seen and encountered lately on Venus. I don't know why it has this accent, but okay. During some of these comparatively recent visits to Mercury, the grubs of these insects may have found their way toward a broad vegetation-laden targo left standing near the edge of the black swamps of Mercury. These grubs were thus transported to Venus and underwent their natural metamorphosis here. Reaching adult age, they may have found some place to hide and breed, and thus is explained the origin of the vampires of Venus. This was widely read and discussed, and was finally accepted as the means of the invasion of the peaceful, beautiful Venus by a horror that might as well have originated in hell. However, this didn't reveal the breeding grounds or remove the nationwide scourge of terrible winged vampires, so the mobilization of all the forces of the planet continued. As day followed day, the hordes of fighting Venus dwellers grew in the concentration camps.
In the Targo of the Bellows, Larner, brain weary and body racked as he was with overwork, found a grain of happiness in being the presence of Nern and his beautiful sister. With Zorn, Larner was supervising the construction of a big net of strongly woven wire mesh, in which it was hoped to catch one of the vampires. It was decided to bait the trap with a fat female lad. Zorn, Larner, and the Bellas fared forth from the concentration camp, followed by a company of soldiers carrying the big net. Tula, with her own hand, led the fat lad after. His eyes were filled with commiseration for the poor animal. Thousands of soldiers and citizenry in fighting array watched the departure of the little group. In a glade the trap was set, and the net arranged to fall over the monster once it attacked the calf. From a thicket in utter darkness, Zorn and Larner and the two Bellas waited for the possible catch. The whole nation stood awaiting the order to advance. On the fourth night the vigil was rewarded in a manner frightful to relate. A clumsy flutter of giant wings broke the stillness, and the four waiting forms in the thicket rejoiced, believing the fat lat was about to be attacked. Onward came the approaching horror, the measured flap of its armored wings drawing nearer and nearer, and then a horror. A feminine scream rent the air. Cries loud and shrill arose above a hysterical feminine cry for help. The monster had chosen Tulabella for its prey. Zorn exploded an alarm bomb, and a compressed air siren brought the army forward on the run. Giant floodlights began to light up the scene, and the blood of Larner and Nern froze. The monster had borne the girl to the ground. Its frightful lance and cupper was upraised to strike. Larner was the nearest and the quickest to act. He grabbed for his ray gun and swung at his belt. It was gone. In horror, he remembered he'd left it at the base. He seized a short knife and threw himself forward, rolling his body between that of the girl and the descending lance and cupper. As the lance pierced his shoulder, Larner, in one wild gesture of the frenzy, drove his knife through the soft, yielding flesh of the vampire's organ of suction. Protected by no bony structure, the snout of the monster was amputated, and the terrible creature had been disarmed of his most formidable weapon, and yet he continued to fight. Larner felt the spikes on the monster's legs tear at his flesh. "Don't kill the thing! Bring on the net! For the love of God, bring on the net!" Then he lost consciousness. It was daylight when Larner, somewhat weakened from the loss of blood, regained consciousness. Tulabella was leaning over him. She whispered comforting words to him in a language he didn't fully understand, and then whispered happy exclamations in words he didn't know the meaning of. The tone was unmistakably those of a sweetheart toward her lover. Finally, in answer to a true scientist's question in his eyes, she said in English, "They caught the thing alive. They await your order to advance. Let us be on our way," said Larner, and he started to arise. "You are hardly strong enough." "Believe me, I'm all right," insisted Larner. And after several trials, he got to his feet. His constitution was naturally strong, and his will was stronger, so he fought back all feelings of weakness, and soon announced he was himself ready to go ahead with the project at hand. For speed was all important, and the young professor found himself unable to remain inactive. He rejoiced when Zorn told him that the big insect that had attacked Tulabella had been captured alive and been kept well nourished by lat's blood injected into its stomach. With Zorn, Larner went to inspect the hideous monstrosity and found it in a leash and straining. It was ready to be used to lead the way back to its breeding place. Its wings shackled, the lumbering insect floundered on its straight way north. Ponderously and half blindly, it crawled, as the searchlight's glare was kept far enough in advance to keep from blinding the monster. True to instinct, it finally brought up, at early dawn, under a high cliff of smoky quartz. Here in the great crevices, the drove of the diabolical vampires was hiding. As light struck their dens, they attempted clumsily to take wing, but an interlacing network of devastating disintegrating rays from the ray guns shattered their bodies to dust, which was borne away by the wind. The next few months were spent in combing the quartz rocks of Venus for similar infested areas, but apparently only the one breeding nest was found. The scourge had been conquered in its first and only stronghold. And so ended the greatest reign of terror in the history of Venus. Leslie Larner was given a vote of thanks, and riches were showered upon him by the good people of the sky's brightest star. His modesty was characteristic, and he insisted that his small part in saving humanity on the planet was, well, small. Passage back to Earth was offered him, but Nern Tulipella urged him to stay and live his life on Venus. This he finally agreed to do. If I returned, I'd always be tempted to tell my experiences while away, and there's really not a jury in the world which would account me sane after I'd spoken, so that's the story of Larner's adventure. The story of Larner's adventure reached Earth dwellers at all is due to the fact that Nern Bella, on a subsequent visit to the Earth, narrated it to a Colorado quartz miner. This miner, bronzed and bearded prospector for gold, stumbled on the Targo in a mountain fastness. There was naught to do but make him welcome and pledge him to secrecy. The miner surveyed the crystal Targo in rapt wonderment and said, "And to think I'm the only Earthman who ever viewed such a craft." "No, there's one other," answered Nern Bella. And then the stirring story of Leslie Larner's life on Venus was told. Anyway, so, that's the Vampires of Venus. Not bad. It's certainly better than the story we started the episode with. I was not a fan of the military story. I'm not really ever a fan of when the stories kind of have that military bend to them. So next one is Safe Flying in Fogs. I don't know if this is Is this like a... I can't tell if this is an ad. This cannot be an ad. Can it? Okay, I think it's like an actual story. If it's an ad, I'll not actually read it. But next time we have Safe Flying in Fogs. Surprisingly. And that's that for this episode of Paper Cuts. So come back next week for Safe Flying in Fogs. And hey, if you're watching this at the time it's first uploaded as the stream VOD, that means that I'm probably still streaming for 12 entire hours playing Code Lyoko. So, if you're into that sort of thing, come drop by. But, thanks for listening, folks. We'll see you next week. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.